Hey, guys. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you've just been born. Congratulations. You're the newest addition to a proud medieval family of executioners. That's right. While other babies are wrapped in linen and destined to become bakers, butchers, or if they're lucky, monks, you are gently placed in a cradle next to a whetstone and an axe. It's not a rattle you're shaking, it's the future. In the Middle Ages, execution wasn't a job you applied for. There was no town hall resume submission. It was inherited, like a really cursed family heirloom. If your father was the executioner, you were the next in line. Simple. No room for career changes. No hopes of becoming a traveling bard or a slightly sad shoemaker. Your path was laid out and it ended at the chopping block. From the moment you're old enough to walk, you're already getting side-eyed by villagers. Other kids run from you at the well. Adults lower their voices when you walk by, as if your tiny toddler hands are already soaked in symbolic blood. Spoiler, they are. Symbolically, of course, for now. You grow up in a house where the family dinner table conversations are less. How was your day? And more, how many strikes should it take to get it clean? There's no escaping it. Your toys might include miniature gallows, and your bedtime stories involve phrases like drawing and quartering, instead of happily ever after. And it's not just the job, it's the reputation. You could be the kindest, most literate, soft-spoken child in the kingdom, and people would still treat you like you sneak into homes at night, whispering threats to chickens. Your very surname might mark you. In some towns, entire family lines of executioners were labeled, tracked, and sometimes forbidden from entering churches, bakeries, or public baths. Hygiene and salvation. Not for you. But hey, there are perks. You'll probably never get bullied too hard. No one wants to mess with the executioner's kid. The fear is real. You might not be liked, but you will be respected in the same way people respect thunder or very sharp knives. So welcome to life. You didn't ask for this, but it's yours now. Forever. So you've just been born. Hooray. A bouncing baby bundle of joy, swaddled in wool, baptized in holy water and immediately cursed with generational trauma. You're the newest member of a family of executioners, medieval society's most necessary yet least invited profession. While other children are destined to churn butter or one day inherit a sheep farm, you've been born into the one job that guarantees everyone will avoid you like a coughing stranger during a plague year. Your future is set. Sharp metal, public crowds, and a lifetime of being the guy no one makes eye contact with, even when you're 6. And no, you don't get to choose. An executioner isn't something you apply to be. There's no medieval job fair with a booth that says love justice, hate popularity, inquire within. If your dad swung the axe, guess what you're swinging after puberty? Even as a toddler, villagers whisper when you pass. You haven't even committed your first decapitation, and you're already treated like you bite livestock. The blacksmith's kid gets candy. You get suspicious glances and extra space in the pews. That is, if you're even allowed in church and family dinners less. How was your day and more? Did you remember to oil the gallows chain? Your bedtime stories don't feature dragons unless they're being hanged for heresy. Your toys include miniature scaffolds. Your version of hide and seek usually ends in people hiding and never coming back. You can't even marry out of it. Most respectable families won't let their daughters within 5 feet of you, let alone the altar. Which is probably fine, since your family name has been whispered like a curse word for the past 3 generations. That's Carl's boy. You know, the one who swung too deep last winter. And sure, there are perks. No one bullies the executioner's kid. Even the local bully doesn't want to end up as practice. You develop a strong back, a steady hand, and a deadpan stare that gets you out of most social events, which is helpful because you're never invited anyway. So there it is. You're not just born, you're branded. You didn't choose the axe life. The axe life chose you, and it's not letting go. By the time you're old enough to grow a beard or swing a training axe, you've already accepted one core truth. The town needs you, but they prefer you stay out of sight, preferably behind a curtain, a hill, or a moral veil of plausible deniability. As a medieval executioner, you're society's walking contradiction. You do the work no one else dares to do, and for that you're rewarded with silence, suspicion, and the occasional terrified blessing from 10 feet away. People talk to you like you're a haunted well, useful in a crisis, but deeply unsettling the rest of the time. Need someone publicly disemboweled? The town calls you. Need someone invited to their daughter's wedding feast? Not a chance. You're the final solution to every problem the sheriff doesn't want on his conscience. And yet, once the deed is done and the head rolls into the hay, everyone suddenly remembers they had somewhere else to be. Usually anywhere that isn't next to you. In court records, you're referred to as the Blade of Justice. In tavern gossip, you're that creepy guy who probably talks to skulls. You could save a child from drowning and someone would still whisper, "Yes, but how many people has he chopped in half?" To them, you are both punishment and paranoia. A reminder that the law has teeth. Big, sharp, public ones. And let's not pretend it's just the peasants. Even nobles turn their noses up. They'll pay you in silver and pat themselves on the back for upholding justice, but you'll never be invited to dine in their halls unless it's to demonstrate proper axe form between courses. Best of all, if something goes wrong, let's say you botch an execution or someone gets squeamish mid-torture. It's your head on the proverbial and possibly literal chopping block. The same crowd that cheered your last performance will turn on you faster than a spooked chicken. You're not a man. You're a tool. And everyone pretends you don't exist unless they need something violently removed. So yes, the town needs you, but they'd rather you come in through the back door, wear a hood, and leave before sunrise. While other boys are learning how to plow fields, shoe horses, or, if they're especially blessed, read. Your education is a bit more specialized. You're not studying scripture or sewing techniques. You're learning how to sever spines in one clean stroke. Welcome to your childhood apprenticeship, where precision isn't optional and failure doesn't just cost lives. It ruins your reputation before you even get one. Your father, or some grizzled older executioner with arms like tree trunks, teaches you the sacred art of not messing up in front of a crowd. Because while everyone may pretend they hate what you do, they absolutely will judge your form, footwork, and follow through like it's the medieval Olympics. Your curriculum includes chopping techniques, because missing the neck by even an inch turns justice into a comedy show. Anatomy, because you need to know which bones are easiest to crack and which ones will make your axe bounce back in public humiliation. And stage presence, because let's face it, every execution is a public performance. You're the final act, the main event, the reason people leave their farms and bring their kids to town square. Think of it as dinner theater. But instead of dessert, there's dismemberment. There's no practice, dummy, unless you count the occasional pig carcass or extremely unlucky rebel. Most of what you learn is on the job. And let's be honest, everyone remembers your first time, especially if it doesn't go well. Especially if you freeze or shake or, heaven forbid, take more than one swing. Nothing haunts you like one half-beheaded criminal in an impatient crowd. You're trained to be calm, efficient, unshakable. But no one teaches you how to cope. There's no medieval HR department, no stress leave, no how to not think about severed heads, self-care scroll. You just sharpen your blade, swallow your guilt, and get ready for the next performance. And what do you get in return for your finely honed lethal expertise? Not admiration, not gratitude, just silence. Maybe a few extra coins, and the lingering stench of death on your clothes and soul. You're not just trained to kill. You're trained to carry the weight of it quietly. Picture this. It's a sunny morning. The market square is bustling. Bakers are selling bread that smells vaguely edible. Blacksmiths are banging away with impressive confidence, and the butcher is enthusiastically waving a cleaver. Everyone is shouting prices, gossiping, living their little medieval lives. Then you show up. The crowd parts like you're carrying the plague in one hand and a severed head in the other. And to be fair, sometimes you are. But even when you're just there to buy turnips, people scatter like rats from a torch. You see, executioners were often forbidden or heavily discouraged from even entering public markets. In some towns, you had to wait until after hours to buy food. In others, you had your own special corner of shame. where vendors left your goods out for you to collect like a cursed medieval DoorDash. Why? Because apparently the man who handles legal killings is somehow too unclean to touch a radish. If you dared to mingle with the regular folks, got awkward fast. Merchants would grab your coins with tongs, or worse, refuse them altogether. You could be holding clean silver, and they'd act like you'd handed them a live scorpion dipped in gill. Oh, no, no, not from you, good sir. We're out of cabbage today. Children are yanked away. Crosses are made. One particularly dramatic fishwife spits every time you walk by. Not at you, just near enough to make her feelings perfectly clear. Touching goods was risky business. If you picked up a loaf of bread, no one else would want it if you so much as grazed the apples. That entire crate might be dumped in a ditch out of sheer spiritual panic. One brush of your cursed executioner fingers, and it's too forbidden. Eventually, most executioners learn to send someone else to do their shopping if they could. A relative, a bribed servant. Anyone with a less unsettling aura. Someone whose hands didn't smell faintly of burning justice. And so you retreat again, back to your lonely dwelling. Your private food supply, your increasingly antisocial lifestyle. Because even when you're off the clock, the town still remembers who you are, and they'd really prefer it if you didn't touch the cheese. Congratulations, you've got your own place. Unfortunately, it's not in town, not even close. Your new address is beyond the northern gate, past the gallows, next to the wild boars. As a medieval executioner, you don't just get the cold shoulder. You get full-on banishment by zoning law. You're not allowed to live inside the city walls with the normal people. Instead, your residence is somewhere between a hermit's hut and a haunted outpost. You're less of a village member and more of an unpleasant forest NPC. There's a reason for this, of course. A combination of superstition, religion, and good old-fashioned hypocrisy. The same folks who hire you to swing an axe at 10 a.m. don't want to risk your allegedly cursed energy wafting through the neighborhood by 6 p.m. Your house is usually located near the execution grounds because that's convenient. Convenient for who exactly remains unclear. Not for you, certainly. You live in the shadow of your work, literally. Gallows creaking in the wind, crows eyeing you like you're next. Sometimes corpses still hang in view of your breakfast table. Bon appetit. The place itself. It's yours, technically. A gift from the city, which is medieval for we dumped some lumber in a field and said good luck. Drafty, damp, and wonderfully secluded, your home might be the only one in Christendom with a doormat that says abandon hope, ye who enter here. Not for visitors, but for your own self-esteem. No neighbors, no casual strolls, no visiting merchants or passing monks. Just you, your tools, and the occasional raccoon with no sense of personal space. You might hear the church bells in the distance, but you won't hear the laughter of the marketplace. You're close enough to serve the town, but far enough to never belong to it. And when storms roll in, who rushes to check on you? No one. The town forgets you until the next criminal needs a very final solution. So there you live, outside the walls, a man apart. Visible only when your presence is required. Like thunder. Ominous, functional, and best appreciated from a distance. So you're an executioner. You live outside the walls. Your handshake is treated like biohazard, and your grocery runs require diplomatic finesse. But surely you can find comfort in family, right? Right, well, here's the thing. Medieval executioners did have families. They just had a hard time starting them. See, once your occupation is known, your dating prospects plummet faster than a heretic through a trapdoor. No one wants to marry the guy whose job description includes the phrase clean up arterial spray. Respectable families lock their doors when you walk by. Fathers hold their daughters closer. Even the town drunk who once proposed to a goat looks at you and says, "A bit much, don't you think?" So your dating pool ends up being shallow. Very shallow. Often the only people willing to marry executioners are other outcasts, gravediggers, knackers, lepers, or if you're lucky, widows whose standards have taken serious structural damage. Romantic candlelit dinners. Try conversations whispered in alleys so no one sees her talking to you. And if you do manage to marry and have children, They inherit your profession like a curse sewn into their skin. Sons are trained from youth to swing steel with surgical precision, and daughters, well, they carry the name, which is usually enough to be socially exiled by age 6. It's not so much a family as it is a legally necessary support staff. Your family can't attend festivals, can't walk through town together, can't pretend to be normal for even a single Sunday. If they do go to church, they sit in the back. Or they don't go at all, because even salvation has bounces. And over time, that isolation takes a toll. You love your children, sure, but you also pass them a future that smells like blood and loneliness. The family tree doesn't grow. It repeats. Same job, same shame, same invisible wall between you and the rest of humanity. There are no proud portraits, no family crests, just a long line of people who wore hoods not to hide their faces, but because the world never wanted to see them in the first place. So you've executed your duties literally all week. You've lopped off heads, disemboweled a heretic or two, and maybe even cleaned your blade with holy water out of sheer anxiety. Surely it's time to confess your sins, right? Light a candle. Say a prayer. Start fresh. Well, not quite. In the eyes of the medieval church, you're somewhere between necessary evil and walking contradiction. Yes, you enforce divine justice. Yes, you serve the state and uphold law and order. But also, and this is important, you kill people for a living, which inconveniently is a sin. And so, despite doing God's dirty work, you are not exactly welcome in his house. Many executioners were outright denied confession. Some priests wouldn't listen. Others insisted you undergo ritual cleansing before stepping inside the church, which is tricky because no amount of soap washes away your reputation. And don't even think about receiving Holy Communion. That was reserved for clean souls. Yours is more of a permanent stain. It's a cruel irony. You kill with state approval, yet spiritually you're treated like a man who strangles kittens for fun. Even lepers, who at least had a medical excuse, were often treated with more compassion. Weddings, not in the church. Christenings, maybe if the priest is having a generous day and half the town isn't glaring at him. Funerals, don't count on it. Some executioners weren't even buried in consecrated ground. They got the ditch outside the cemetery walls. Prime real estate for exiles, suicides, and people who forgot to tithe. So where does that leave you spiritually? Nowhere comforting. You spend your life surrounded by death, and yet you have no path to forgiveness. You can't unburden yourself. You can't cry to a friar or light a votive for your sins. Instead, you carry them quietly, heavily. Sometimes you drink. Sometimes you scream into the woods. Sometimes you just sharpen your blade again. Even when you believe you're doing right, when the law is clear, the trial fair, you still go home unsure whether you're damned by man, by God, or both. Because even in a world where everyone sins, you're the one who made a profession out of it. There's nothing quite like the pressure of performing executions in front of a screaming crowd. It's part justice, part ritual, part public entertainment, and you're the main act. Forget about nerves. Forget about bad weather. The crowd doesn't care if your wrist hurts, if your stomach's empty, or if the axe is a little dull from last week's double hanging. They came to see a show. And you're holding the spotlight and the blade. The goal is simple. One clean swing. A fast, clean beheading is the gold standard. Anything less, and the murmurs begin. Miss by an inch. The crowd gasps. Take a second swing. They groan a third. Now they're booing. Some are laughing. One kid just started crying. Someone throws an onion. And let's be honest, you feel it too. The shame, the failure, the victim still twitching on the block, the blood spurting wrong, your boots sticky with regret. You weren't trained for this part. The psychological shrapnel that comes from turning someone's last moment into a civic embarrassment. Sometimes the axe gets caught in bone. Sometimes the condemned jerks at the last second. Sometimes your hand just slips. And in those moments, your entire reputation, and possibly your job hangs in the balance. Because here's the thing. No one cares how hard the job is. They just want it to look easy. Executioners are supposed to be clinical, unemotional, precise. If you falter, you risk looking weak. And in a world obsessed with strength, weakness is contagious and the rumors spread fast. He needed 2 swings. His hand was shaking. The guy suffered. You become a cautionary tale, whispered in bread lines. Don't end up like that poor soul, like the guy who couldn't even. And finish the job. So you go home, scrub your blade, and relive every mistake, every gasp, every groan. You replay it until your mind is too tired to keep spinning. And even then, it lingers. Because in your world, the axe doesn't just fall on the condemned. It hovers over you too, every time you step onto that platform. So you've done the deed. The crowd is gasped, gawked, and dispersed. The condemned is headless, justice is served, and the village square is back to selling cabbage. Time to pack up and head home, right? Not even close. Being an executioner wasn't just about swinging an axe. That was the dramatic part. The flashy moment. The rest, far messier, far quieter, and far more grotesquely underappreciated. Because someone has to deal with the body. And surprise, it's you. You might be asked to burn the body, bury it in unconsecrated ground, or stuff it into a shallow grave under the gallows. The medieval equivalent of a garbage chute. No funeral, no ceremony. Just the faint hope that the local dogs don't dig it up, and you don't get gloves or soap or a break. You are effectively the sanitation department of death, the final cleaner of sin, the silent janitor of justice, and no one thanks you, in fact. The same people who cheer the execution now avoid you even harder because you smell like ash and entrails. There are also side jobs. Torture, that's on you. Branding criminals, you again. Public shaming setups, you're the guy with the hammer and nails. Sometimes they'll even have you flog someone while reading scripture aloud, multitasking your way through a moral meltdown. Oh, and if a noble demands discretion, guess who's cleaning up the noble's mess with 0 witnesses and a very real understanding that if anyone talks, they're next executioner by title. Yes, but by function, your medieval society's all-purpose horror technician. When the crowds disappear, the priests go silent, and the court scribes head back to their parchment. You stay behind. You finish the job no one else can stomach for all the fear, revulsion, and existential dread wrapped around your role. Being an executioner does come with one undeniable perk. You get paid. In fact, you're often paid more than your average peasant. Sometimes much more. Executions, torture sessions, dismemberment duties. They all come with a tidy purse of silver. Add in bribes for extra discretion or making it quick, and you might even find yourself with a kind of money that makes bakers envious. But here's the catch. You can't spend it like a normal person. You walk into a tavern with a jingling pouch, and suddenly the room gets real quiet. The barkeep pours your ale, then wipes the counter like your presence is a stain. You tip him double. He still won't look you in the eye. You go to buy a new tunic, and the tailor hands you the finished product with tongs. The coins you give him are real, but to him, they're cursed. Blood money. He mutters, as if the silver will bite him. And heaven forbid you try to give charity. One time you tried donating to the church. They took the donation, then used it to pay someone else to clean the holy relics just in case. Sure, you can accumulate wealth. You might even build a small home with actual furniture. Rare for your class. But the irony? The more you earn, the more isolated you become. You're rich, yes, but rich like a dragon, hoarding gold in a cave, alone and feared. People assume the money makes up for the stigma, that a heavy purse balances a heavy conscience. But gold doesn't silence nightmares. It doesn't scrub blood from your memory or buy you back your humanity. It just sits there, cold, shiny, useless for the things that matter. You don't buy peace with money in the Middle Ages. You buy silence. You buy space. You buy the right to drink alone at a corner table without being told to leave. And deep down, you know the truth. Every coin you carry was bought with someone else's last breath. That's the currency of your life, and no amount of it ever buys forgiveness. In a town of maybe a few 100 people, everyone knows who you are. They know your name, your house, your footsteps, your job, and most importantly, your shadow. They whisper it. That's him. They murmur it as you pass. Executioner. They pull their children close, as if you might accidentally decapitate someone mid-walk. And yet, despite this widespread recognition, no one really knows you. You could have a favorite song, a childhood memory, a surprisingly decent hand at wood carving, but that doesn't matter. Your entire identity is reduced to one role. The blade. People don't see you. They see what you do. You're a living job description. Even when you're off duty, just walking to buy onions, people cross the street like you're contagious. No one asks how you're doing. No one asks if the job weighs on you, because they've already decided you don't feel anything. To them, you're not a man with doubts or regrets. You're the axe with legs. It's a strange duality. You are known by everyone, yet fully understood by no one. You're present in every courtroom sentence, every hushed bedtime story, every moral lesson whispered to misbehaving kids, but never really invited into the world you serve. When you walk into the tavern, voices are quiet. When you leave, they rise again. You hear laughter, but never with you. Always after you've gone. How was your day? No. You holding up, all right? No. Do you ever wish it was different? If you speak too much, you're unsettling. If you say nothing, you're cold. If you smile, that's the worst. It's creepy. The man who swings the sword shouldn't be smiling. Ever. And so over time, you play the part. You become the figure they already believe you are. Grim, silent, and carved from stone. You learn to stand still. To nod to fate. Because while everyone in town knows your name, not a single one of them knows you. You're a myth with a pulse, a necessary ghost, familiar in function, alien in everything else. After a long day of dismemberment, blood-stained boots, and polite public trauma, you finally return home to your charming little hut outside the walls, surrounded by silence and a slight smell of iron. You take off your cloak. You lay down your axe. You sit at the edge of your straw mattress and try to be human again. But the nightmares are already waiting. You lie down and close your eyes. And there they are, the faces. Not heroic, not villainous. Just people. Some screamed. Some cried. Some mumbled prayers with trembling lips. Some looked you straight in the eyes as if to say, you know this is wrong. And the worst ones. The ones who said nothing at all. The calm ones. The resigned ones. The ones who accepted their fate faster than you ever could. You relive every swing. You feel every bone crunch. You hear the gasps of the crowd, their disgust, their delight. You see the bodies falling in slow motion, like tragic marionettes with their strings cut. There's no escape. Not in sleep. Not in silence. Not in drink. Believe me, you've tried. You start to flinch at everyday sounds. The clatter of firewood, the snap of rope, the creak of wooden stairs. All reminders, all echoes. And you never forget the ones you botched. The blade that hesitated, the cut that went crooked, the moan of someone who was supposed to die faster. You carry that. No one checks on you. There's no medieval counselor for post-traumatic decapitation disorder. You don't write letters. You don't cry in public. You stare into the fire and hope your soul doesn't go fully numb before your hands do. Sometimes, late at night, you ask yourself, what if they were innocent? What if justice got it wrong? What if I got it wrong? But you already know the answer doesn't matter because the sentence was passed. The crowd gathered. The axe fell. And the nightmares stayed. You were trained to kill, not to grieve. But your dreams didn't get the memo. So you wake up with clenched fists, aching temples and blood that won't wash away because it's not on your hands anymore. It's in your head. The thing no one tells you when you become an executioner is this. You don't retire. There's no farewell feast, no pension, no golden axe mounted on a plaque. You just start shaking one day, or missing or dreaming too loudly. And the town begins to whisper. Not with sympathy, with concern. Not for you, for efficiency. Because to them, you're not a man. You're a mechanism, a moving part in the justice machine. As long as the blade is sharp and the swing is steady, they nod from a distance and pretend you don't exist. But the moment you falter, the instant your hands tremble on the block, or you take a second too long with a rope, the machine creaks and they all notice. Suddenly you're a problem, a liability. Not because your soul is unraveling, but because you're disrupting the spectacle. The crowd didn't come to see guilt. They came to see competence. So the town begins its quiet transition. Maybe a younger man, your apprentice, your son, your distant cousin, starts handling smaller jobs. A flogging here, a branding there, then a hanging. No one tells you you've been replaced. You simply start getting fewer summonses. The coin slows. The stares change from fear to faint pity. The most dangerous kind of pity, because it means they've stopped needing you. And when you're finally forgotten, it's not by accident. It's design. You fade into your cottage outside the walls, your tools rusting beside you. Your hands, once strong and precise, now tremble when you lift a spoon. Your knees ache from a lifetime of kneeling at the block, and no one comes to visit. Your name becomes an uncomfortable footnote in village memory. Remember old what's his name? The one with axe? Oh yeah, didn't he go mad? And when you finally die, probably alone, the church still isn't sure whether to bury you inside the gate or just leave you under a tree somewhere. Because in the end, you were never part of the town. You were a service, and services, when worn out, are quietly discarded. At first, the job made sense. The condemned were thieves, murderers, heretics. You were the arm of the law, the edge of justice. You didn't question. You executed efficiently, publicly, without hesitation. But as the years dragged on and the block grew slick with repetition, something began to itch beneath the surface of your certainty. It starts small. A man sentenced for stealing a loaf of bread. He had 5 children. No defense, just hunger. Then a woman was accused of witchcraft because she muttered prayers in the wrong language. You saw the fear in her eyes, the absolute confusion as the noose slipped over her neck. And then the nobles, the ones who ordered deaths, not because of guilt, but because of politics. Land, jealousy, or the need to make someone disappear. You start to realize you're not just burying criminals, you're burying secrets. The executioner's block becomes a filter, one that sifts out the inconvenient, the poor, the powerless. And you're the final stamp, the one who makes it irreversible. You want to believe in law, in structure, in right and wrong. But the voices that once declared guilt so confidently now ring hollow. You've heard the crowd cheer as a man screamed. You've seen magistrates exchange glances like merchants haggling over a soul, and you are always told it is not your place to judge. You only carry out the sentence. But what happens when the sentence is wrong? There's no room to ask, no confessional booth, no forum. You sit alone at night, sharpening your blade, wondering how many lives were ended because someone needed a message sent. And you can't say anything. Not just because it's dangerous, but because who would listen? You're the executioner. No one believes the man who wears the hood. You don't get opinions, you get orders. So you bury justice one stroke at a time. Not because you want to, but because you have to. Because in this world, truth is a luxury, and you're just the broom that sweeps it under the scaffold. And the worst part, you're starting to think you were never justice's sword, just its grave digger. You spend your life in service. Not to glory, not to gold, not even to justice, just to duty. The grim, blood-soaked kind no one talks about at feasts. And when your end finally comes, it isn't dramatic, no poetic final words. No family gathered at your bedside. Just a cough that doesn't go away. A slow fade in a straw-stuffed bed that still smells faintly of iron and damp rope. One final breath and that's it. No bells toll. No priest rushes to your side. No one weeps. Your body is found by a local boy, or maybe not found at all until the smell becomes a problem. The town clerk marks your passing in one sentence, scribbled on the back of a tax ledger. Executioner, deceased, replacement pending. There's no funeral procession, No carved headstone, maybe a wooden marker if someone remembers. But it won't last the winter. You're not buried in the churchyard, of course. You're laid in the earth outside the gates, the same gates you were never allowed to pass through in life. Executioners, after all, were unclean, tainted, and useful, disposable. You were the one who buried hundreds, and yet no one truly buries you. The town moves on quickly. There's always another blade, another son, another poor soul who inherits the job like a curse wrapped in tradition. In the years to come, people might speak of you in fragments. The one who beheaded that baron, remember? The one who drank alone and never looked anyone in the eye. Or worse, what was his name again? Your legacy isn't stories or children or peace. It's silent. It's absence. It's the space you fill that no one wants to talk about. And maybe that's fitting. You spent your life ensuring the guilty were forgotten. You just didn't realize you'd be forgotten with them. So in the end, your death mirrors your life. Necessary, but never mourned, because in medieval society, you were never meant to be remembered. You were meant to be endured. And now you're finally not. It all started with water running through a ditch. On January 24, 1848, a man named James W. Marshall, working on the American River near Coloma, California, looked down and saw something strange glinting in the sun. At first, he didn't believe it. It was just a tiny yellow flake. Could have been fool's gold. But no, it passed the scratch test. It was real gold. Actual gold. He ran to tell his boss, John Sutter, who was less than thrilled. Sutter wasn't thinking about riches. He was thinking about land. He was building an agricultural empire, and he knew what a gold discovery meant. Yes, stampedes of strangers, squatter claims, and the end of his carefully laid dreams. So the two men tried to keep it quiet. Spoiler, they failed miserably. Within weeks, the rumors spread like wildfire, literally faster than the mail system. Locals were showing up with pans and pickaxes. People abandoned jobs mid-shift. Sailors jumped ship in San Francisco and vanished into the hills. Newspapers didn't even bother fact-checking. Gold found in California was printed like gospel, and then all hell broke loose. That summer, President Polk confirmed the discovery in a speech to Congress. That was it. The genie was out of the bottle. By 1849, over 90,000 people nicknamed 49ers were pouring into California by land, sea, and every miserable in-between route imaginable. And what started as one man squinting into a ditch became the largest mass migration in the U.S. history. But here's the thing. Marshall never got rich. Neither did Sutter. The discoverers ended up broke, bitter, and pushed aside as the gold fever they unleashed consumed everything. So picture it. One accidental flicker in a muddy trench led to a global stampede, reshaped the map, fueled American expansion, and catapulted California from sleepy frontier to statehood in just 2 years. And the irony? The men who found the gold, they barely got a nugget. Now that we've set the stage, let's dive deeper into the madness, the migration, and the myths that turned California into the land of golden dreams and broken promises. Imagine you're a farmer in Ohio or a shopkeeper in Boston in 1849. You hear the whispers, see the headlines, gold, mountains of it, just lying there for the taking in California. You sell your land, kiss your family goodbye, and start walking literally across the country. That's what thousands did. And just like that, the age of the 49ers had begun. They came in waves from every state and from places much farther. Latin Americans, Australians, Europeans, even a contingent of Chinese miners braving the treacherous Pacific crossing. Some came in covered wagons, enduring cholera, starvation, and every kind of weather hell the West could throw at them. Others boarded creaky ships, took a detour through Panama, and hoped they wouldn't catch yellow fever before boarding another ship into San Francisco. And oh, San Francisco, a once sleepy port town with maybe 1,000 residents before the rush. By the end of 1849, over 25,000 people had flooded in. It was a surreal transformation. Canvas tents popped up faster than buildings. Whole ships were abandoned and turned into warehouses, prisons, and hotels. You could walk through the harbor without touching water, just stepping from one deserted ship deck to another. It wasn't glamorous. Picture mountains of mud, makeshift saloons, overpriced pickaxes, and a real estate market that made Manhattan look like a bargain bin. A single egg might cost you threes. Decent pair of boots? Good luck. Maybe $100. Inflation ran wild, and scams were more common than gold nuggets. But that didn't matter. The dream was enough. Gold fever had its grip. Some struck it rich in a single afternoon. Others dug for years and died penniless. The rivers of the Sierra Nevada became clogged with miners, each swinging a pan, hoping their next scoop would change everything. This migration changed more than just California. It altered the entire American psyche. Suddenly, hard work wasn't just noble. It might make you wealthy. Manifest destiny got a shot of adrenaline. California, barely a blip on the map a year before, was now the promised land. Of course, when thousands of desperate men pile into the same few valleys with shovels, things get tense, so you've made it. You've walked across deserts, survived dysentery, and maybe even dodged a few bandits. You've reached the gold country. Congratulations. Now the real misery begins. Mining wasn't a glorious treasure hunt. It was back-breaking, soul-crushing labor. Forget chests full of gold coins. This was hours spent knee-deep in freezing rivers, swirling pans of gravel, praying to find a glimmer. Most didn't for every lucky strike. There were 1,000 empty pans and 10,000 aching backs. In the early days, it was all about placer mining, scooping gravel from riverbeds and letting water do the work. But as the easy gold vanished, things escalated. Miners turned to rockers, sluices, and eventually hydraulic mining, a violent process that blasted entire hillsides apart with water cannons. It tore through the land and poisoned rivers, but it got results. The camps were chaotic. Imagine a rowdy collection of tents, makeshift cabins, and saloons all stitched together by desperation and mud. Bathing was optional. Food was scarce. Whiskey was not. Violence simmered under the surface. Arguments over claims turned deadly fast, especially when no one trusted the courts and everyone had a shovel. And then there was the disease, with thousands crammed into unsanitary camps. Cholera and dysentery were just part of daily life. If you didn't die from contaminated water, you might die from a poorly cooked squirrel or an infection from a minor cut. There were no real doctors, just a few medicine men with more moonshine than medical knowledge. To top it all off, the prices were absurd. A shovel that cost $2 in New York could run you $30 in the mines. Eggs were luxury items. Laundry. Hope you enjoy wearing dirt, and if you struck it rich, good luck keeping it. Theft was rampant. One moment you had a pouch of gold dust. The next morning it was gone, and so was your bunkmate. But somehow the myth endured. People kept coming. The hope, the gamble, the raw possibility of it all was enough. Where gold went, people followed, and where people went, chaos wasn't far behind. The gold rush didn't just create mining camps. It birthed entire towns overnight. Places like Placerville, Marysville, and Deadwood. Yes, that Deadwood exploded in population faster than anyone could control. They were called boom towns, and the name fit. They boomed into existence and often collapsed just as fast. These were places without laws, without real government, and often without a moral compass. Judges were rare, sheriffs were rare, and the gold, it made men desperate. If you didn't stake a good claim, someone might steal it. If you did stake a good claim, someone might still try to steal it or just shoot you and take it. Enter the vigilantes in towns where the law hadn't arrived or had been paid off. Citizens often took justice into their own hands. Vigilante groups formed, sometimes with noble intent, other times with pure greed. Trials could be quick, sentences quicker. If someone was caught stealing gold or cheating at cards, they might be hanged from the nearest tree without so much as a trial. It wasn't justice, it was convenience. The saloons were the nerve centers of these towns, gambling, drinking, brawling. and the occasional accidental gunshot were all part of the soundtrack. And if you were looking for company, the Soiled Doves, women who'd followed the rush westward, ran the bordellos, charging premiums for their companionship and surviving in a world heavily tilted against them. Still, not everyone was lawless. Many tried to build real communities. Churches sprang up, schools opened, and newspapers began circulating. San Francisco even formed a committee of vigilance to root out corruption and ended up becoming more powerful than the actual government. One strange detail: gold wasn't always used for buying things. It was too easy to shave off. Instead, people traded in gold dust, literally measured by tiny brass scales on the bar counter. A pinch might get you a meal, a full pouch, a night you might not remember, but boom towns weren't built to last. Once the gold dried up, so did the population. Many towns were abandoned, becoming ghost towns almost overnight. While prospectors chased dreams of wealth, others paid a price that was far higher than gold. The California Gold Rush wasn't just a story of fortune. It was also one of displacement, violence, and racial injustice. And the first to suffer were the Native American tribes. California's indigenous peoples had lived in the region for thousands of years, but once the rush began, they were driven from their lands with brutal speed. Forests were cut down, rivers poisoned by mercury and sediment, and hunting grounds overtaken by miners and boomtowns. Some tribes were forced into servitude under the guise of apprenticeships. Others were outright massacred. State-sanctioned militia campaigns were even funded to remove native populations. It was nothing short of a disaster. In just 2 decades, California's native population plummeted by nearly 90%, and then came the waves of immigrants, especially the Chinese. By the early 1850s, tens of thousands of Chinese laborers had arrived in California, most intended to work, earn money, and send it home to their families. But what they got instead was suspicion, racism, and harsh taxes. In 1850, California passed a foreign miners tax, targeting the Chinese specifically. They were banned from owning land, from testifying against white men in court, and from mining without paying extortion-level fees. Yet despite these barriers, many Chinese miners endured. They formed tight-knit communities, reworked abandoned claims, and even built the backbone of future infrastructure, laying tracks for the Transcontinental Railroad just a few years later. Mexican and Latin American miners were also pushed out, often violently. Despite having legitimate claims and gold mining experience, they were hounded out of towns, labeled greasers, and stripped of their rights. And African Americans, both free and enslaved individuals, came to W seeking opportunity. Some did find it, establishing businesses, farms, and even newspapers. But the racial lines were always shifting. The promise of freedom came with no guarantees. Slavery wasn't legal in California, but loopholes were exploited by Southern slaveholders who brought enslaved people with them under other names. The gold rush transformed America, but it also revealed its deepest contradictions. It was a land of opportunity, yes, but only for some. Gold didn't just glitter. It greased the gears of a transforming nation. The California Gold Rush injected a seismic jolt into the U.S. economy. By 1852, gold exports from California totaled over $80 million. That's billions in today's dollars. That kind of influx doesn't just fill pockets. It fills banks, backs currencies, and fuels industries. Suddenly, California wasn't a sleepy western frontier. It was the epicenter of national attention, wealth, and ambition. But there was one big problem. California wasn't a state. It wasn't even organized territory in the traditional sense. It had been acquired in 1848 after the Mexican-American War, but governance was a mess. The sudden flood of settlers made it clear something had to be done and fast. So in 1850, just 2 years after the first gold nugget was found, California became the 31st state. That's warp speed for U.S. expansion. And unlike many other Western territories, it bypassed the awkward adolescent years as a territory. Straight to statehood, no waiting in line. But there was a catch. California was admitted as a free state, banning slavery. This sent the already fragile balance between free and slave states into a tailspin. The South was furious, the North was energized, and the political tension pushed the nation one step closer to civil war. Meanwhile, back in California, the wealth kept flowing, and not just from gold. Entrepreneurs realized that the miners were the real gold mine. A German immigrant named Levi Strauss began selling tough canvas pants that miners couldn't tear through and invented blue jeans. Leland Stanford sold supplies to miners before going on to help build the Transcontinental Railroad and found Stanford University. That railroad, by the way, became the artery connecting California's gold to eastern markets. Before the railroads, it took months to reach California by land or sea, with trains a matter of days. The gold rush didn't just spark economic growth. It sparked infrastructure, commerce, and a boom in western migration. And while California grew richer and more connected, the U.S. realized something else. Whoever controlled the West might just control the future. If the gold rush turned men into legends, it also turned landscapes into battlegrounds. The earliest mining efforts were relatively low-impact pans, shovels, maybe a rocker box along a riverbank. But as the surface gold ran out, miners turned to more aggressive methods. That's when things got ugly. By the mid-1850s, hydraulic mining arrived. Picture this. Massive nozzles called monitors shot water with enough pressure to blast entire hillsides apart. Entire mountains were turned to mud slurry in the hunt for tiny flakes of gold. It was fast, efficient, and utterly devastating. Trees were flattened. The hills disappeared. Rivers ran brown for miles. Sediment from hydraulic mining clogged riverbeds and flooded farmlands. The once fertile Central Valley began drowning under tons of mining debris. The Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers overflowed not just from rainfall, but from the unnatural buildup of displaced earth. Crops died. Towns flooded. Fish populations collapsed. It wasn't mining. It was slow-motion environmental warfare. Miners also used mercury to help separate gold from sediment. It worked, but the mercury didn't disappear. It seeped into soil, flowed downstream, and poisoned ecosystems. To this day, mercury from the gold rush era is still found in California's waterways nearly 2 centuries later. Eventually, the destruction became impossible to ignore. In the 1880s, a group of Central Valley farmers sued a hydraulic mining company in a case that became a national landmark, Woodrow Reverse North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company. The farmers won, and in 1884, hydraulic mining was effectively banned, the first major environmental ruling in the U.S. history. But the damage had been done. The California landscape had been reshaped, sometimes beyond recognition. Forests turned to barren mudflats, hills hollowed out and never recovered. Rivers were rerouted, ecosystems appended. And yet the gold rush also sparked the beginning of America's environmental conscience. As people saw the toll, voices began to rise, calling for balance, for responsibility, for protection of the land. These were the seeds that, decades later, would grow into national parks and conservation movements. The gold rush built dreams, yes, but it also left scars. By the late 1850s, the richest gold veins had been tapped. Boom towns began to empty, and the pickaxes were traded in for plows, pens, and printing presses. But the gold rush wasn't fading. It was transforming. What started as a chaotic scramble became a cultural myth. The California Gold Rush etched itself into the American imagination as a story of adventure, freedom, and reinvention. Newspapers spun tales of lucky strikes and overnight millionaires, while dime novels turned grubby prospectors into rugged heroes of the West. Of course, reality was messy, but myths rarely need facts. The prospector became an American icon, weathered hat, long beard, gold pan in hand. Never mind that most real miners were broken, broke, or buried in shallow graves. The image stuck. California became synonymous with opportunity. The American dream suddenly had a location. Even phrases we still use today were born in this gold-soaked era. Striking it rich, panning for gold, and yes, even the mother lode. They all echo the lingo of 1850s mining camps. And let's not forget the iconic Levi's jeans, born from the rugged needs of miners and eventually adopted by the world. Cities like San Francisco leaned into the legend. What had once been a lawless port now rebranded itself as a gateway to success. Tourism pamphlets spoke of gold country, and old mining towns began staging festivals, reenactments, and parades, celebrating a time that had nearly broken them. The gold rush also deeply influenced American cinema. Westerns romanticized the lone miner with a heart gold, fending off claim jumpers and wooing saloon girls. It wasn't accurate, but it sold tickets and helped cement the frontier myth in popular culture. But beneath the glamorized legends lay harder truths of environmental damage, racial exclusion, and lives lost in pursuit of fleeting glitter. Still, the dream endured. And perhaps that was the point. Because the gold rush wasn't just about wealth, it was about hope. The belief that if you were brave or lucky or stubborn enough, you could change your life with a shovel and some grit. The California Gold Rush officially ended in 1855, but its impact never really stopped. California, once a remote Mexican frontier, had become a powerhouse. Within just a few years, it had gained statehood, reshaped America's economy, and attracted people from every continent. But more than that, it had become a symbol of reinvention, of ambition, of what might still be buried just beneath the surface. The population surge didn't just bring gold hunters. It brought builders, teachers, merchants, and dreamers. Former miners started farms, businesses, and newspapers. The infrastructure built for gold was repurposed for growth. Roads turned into trade routes, camps into cities, and shacks into homes. San Francisco went from a mud-soaked outpost to a thriving metropolis practically overnight. And the gold rush didn't just leave physical scars. It left an emotional blueprint. That same gamble-all attitude would later fuel the rise of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and the counterculture movements. Whether it was celluloid, silicon, or psychedelics, the idea was the same. Come west, try something wild, and maybe, just maybe, you'll strike gold. Even the tech boom of the late 20th and early 21st centuries echoes the spirit of 49. Young entrepreneurs, fueled by belief in caffeine, rushing into California with nothing but a laptop and a dream. It's not so different from those dusty miners with pickaxes and high hopes. But the gold rush also reminds us of what ambition can cost. Native communities decimated, ecosystems disrupted, inequality baked into the economy from the very start. For every lucky strike, there were hundreds left behind, forgotten in the footnotes. Today, remnants of that era still of the landscape. Ghost towns, rusted mining equipment, and winding trails through the Sierra Nevada. Museums preserve the artifacts. Schools teach the legends, and tourism boards sell the fantasy. But the deeper legacy lies in the psyche. The gold rush gave America a permanent sense of urgency. The idea that something bigger, better, richer is always out there. All you have to do is chase it. So when you hear the phrase California Dream, remember it started with a shimmer in the dirt, and 1,000 men willing to risk everything for a shot at something more. Long before anyone carved laws into stone or inked treaties onto papyrus, trade was already shaping the ancient world. It began not with maps or merchants, but with footsteps, worn tracks across hills and valleys trodden by prehistoric peoples in search of what they lacked long before the Silk Road, the Amber Road, or the Spice Route. There were trails of salt, stone, and survival. Imagine a time before writing, before cities, when humans lived in scattered tribal groups, bartering goods out of necessity. One village had flint, another had shells, one-third had access to salt, a precious preservative in a world without refrigeration. Somehow those items moved, traded hand to hand, tribe to tribe, across vast and difficult terrain, and the evidence is clear. Obsidian from Anatolia shows up in Neolithic dig sites hundreds of miles away. Baltic amber turns up in graves as far south as Mycenae and Greece. Someone long before borders and bureaucracy was moving these goods. These first trade routes were not carved or engineered. They were organic, dictated by nature. Rivers became highways. Mountain passes became corridors. Forest trails became lifelines, and with each passing generation these paths grew more defined. Hunters became traders and traders became messengers, carrying not only goods, but also gossip, stories, and even early religious ideas. Trade wasn't just about objects, it was about knowledge. It was how farming techniques, metallurgical skills, and even early artistic styles spread between cultures. A tribe that learned how to smelt copper from another might change its entire way of life. A decorative motif shared through traded pottery might inspire a whole new artistic tradition. These exchanges were slow, often spanning generations, but they were revolutionary, and all of this happened before writing existed. The legacy of these early routes lies in their persistence. Many later trade roads, like parts of the Silk Road or the Arabian incense trails, followed the same general paths first used by prehistoric traders. These invisible highways were the nervous system of early human connection, a web of trails that wove the world together long before anyone ever drew a map. By 3000 BCE, the scattered barter trails of prehistory had evolved into something more sophisticated. Structured commerce between cities, kingdoms, and eventually empires. Nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. Often called the cradle of civilization, it was also the cradle of ancient commerce. The Sumerians and later the Akkadians and Babylonians weren't just farmers and builders, they were traders, and they knew the value of keeping records. Around this time, they developed cuneiform, one of the earliest known writing systems. At first, it was used to track goods, how much grain was traded, how many goats exchanged, and what quantity of beer was delivered to the temple storehouse. In other words, writing was born out of the need to manage trade. These Mesopotamian cities didn't have everything they needed, so trade became essential. They imported timber from the Levant, copper from Oman, tin from Iran, and precious stones like lapis lazuli from what is now Afghanistan. They exported textiles, grain, and intricately crafted goods. The merchants who facilitated this trade weren't adventurers, they were professionals, often backed by temples or royal houses with contracts, ledgers, and risk-sharing agreements. Mesopotamia's trade routes extended overland and along waterways. The Euphrates and Tigris served as the main arteries, with barges ferrying goods between cities like Ur, Uruk, and Babylon. Overland, caravans of donkeys carried goods north to Anatolia or east toward Elam. Trade wasn't just economic, it was political. Alliances were forged through exchange. Kings sent gifts to secure peace, and merchants acted as informal diplomats, carrying messages between distant lands. The concept of a merchant class began to emerge. These weren't nobles, priests, or warriors. They were specialists in negotiation, risk, and logistics, and they wielded real influence. In time, their presence became essential to the stability of these early urban economies. Mesopotamia showed that trade could bind cities together, create wealth and DR. Innovation. It transformed exchange from necessity to system, from handshakes to contracts. While Mesopotamian merchants ruled the rivers and overland routes of the Near East, another civilization rose to dominate the seas, the Phoenicians. By 1200 BCE, these master sailors were from the Levantine coast, modern-day Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Israel, had transformed the Mediterranean into one of history's most active maritime trade networks. The Phoenicians didn't build empires through conquest. They built them through commerce. Their city-states, notably Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, were small but fiercely independent, and they shared a common gift, the sea. With narrow strips of land and limited agriculture, these cities turned to the waves for survival, and they did more than survive. They thrived. Phoenician ships were fast, durable, and ahead of their time. They pioneered the use of burums, ships with 2 rows of oars, making long-distance sea travel more efficient and reliable. These vessels crisscrossed the Mediterranean, trading everything from timber and glass to the famed Tyrian purple dye extracted from sea snails and worth its weight in gold. But perhaps their most lasting legacy was what they carried along with their cargo: the alphabet. The Phoenician writing system, with its 22 consonantal letters, will go on to inspire Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew scripts, the backbone of modern written communication. They established trading posts from Cyprus to Carthage, from Sicily to southern Spain. Carthage itself, which later became Rome's fiercest rival, started as a humble Phoenician outpost. These coastal colonies created a commercial network that rivaled any terrestrial empire. And Phoenician trade wasn't just about moving goods, it was about cultural diffusion. Through their interactions, They spread technologies, religious practices, and art styles across 3 continents. Egyptian scarabs ended up in Iberian graves. Babylonian cylinder seals were found in Greek islands. A web of connection grew, tied not by blood or blade, but by trade. Yet for all their influence, the Phoenicians left behind few monumental ruins. Their legacy is quieter, found in shipwrecks, scattered pottery, and the alphabets we still use today. As seafarers like the Phoenicians turned the Mediterranean into a commercial superhighway, another equally vital network was thriving far from the coast, across the vast deserts of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. These were the trade routes of camel caravans, ancient highways etched into sand where survival was earned mile by mile. The desert may seem like a barrier, but for ancient traders, it was a corridor. Long before paved roads, camel caravans connected sub-Saharan Africa with North Africa, the Levant, and Arabia. These routes moved gold, salt, frankincense, myrrh, ivory, slaves, and stories. The camel, known as the ship of the desert, made it all possible. Domesticated around 1000 BCE, the dromedary camel could endure scorching heat, travel days without water, and carry loads of up to 600 pounds. In North Africa, the trans-Saharan trade routes flourished between kingdoms like Ghana, Mali, and later Songhai. These were not barren wastelands. They were networks of oases, market towns, and fortified caravanserais, where traders rested, watered their camels, and exchanged goods under starlit skies. Gold from the Niger River basin traveled north, often traded weight for weight with salt, a vital resource in the tropics. Salt from the Sahara was cut into massive blocks and transported east, forming the backbone of empires. Meanwhile, in Arabia, the incense trade was booming. Frankincense and myrrh harvested in southern Arabia. Modern Yemen and Oman were highly prized in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome for their use in temples, medicine, and burials. Caravans traversed the Arabian desert along routes like the Incense Road, stopping at cities such as Petra and Mecca long before Islam's rise. These weren't quick trips. Some caravans took months, even years. Traders faced sandstorms, bandits, and extreme dehydration. But the rewards were enormous. Cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Ubar grew rich and influential, serving as hubs of wealth, culture, and learning. What the desert trade lacked in monuments, it made up for in resilience. These routes connected continents, empires, and faiths. They stitched together Africa, Arabia, and beyond, one hoofprint at a time. No ancient trade network captured the imagination or reshaped the world. Quite like the Silk Road, spanning over 4,000 miles from China to the Mediterranean, it wasn't a single RD, but a tangled web of caravan trails, mountain passes, and river crossings that wove together the destinies of entire civilizations. It began in earnest during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, when the Chinese Emperor Wudi sent envoy Zhang Qian westward in search of allies. What he found instead was opportunity. The discovery that distant peoples were eager for China's most luxurious export, silk. Lightweight, durable, and practically glowing, silk became a sensation across Central Asia, Persia, and eventually Rome, where senators paid fortunes to wear it and then nervously declared it decadent and dangerous. But silk was just the beginning. East met West in the form of goods, ideas, and even diseases. From China came porcelain, tea, and paper. From India, spices, gemstones, and Buddhism. Persia offered carpets, glassware, and horses. Rome and later Byzantium exported wine, olive oil, and fine metalwork. Every link in the chain brought something new and received something unexpected. The road itself was brutal. Traders crossed scorching deserts like the Taklamakan and climbed icy peaks in the Palmares. Bandits lurked at every pass, and merchants rarely made the full journey. Instead, goods changed hands dozens of times, passed along like whispers through markets, and caravans arose. Cultural exchange flourished alongside commerce. Monks, missionaries, and musicians traveled these paths, spreading philosophies and fables. The Silk Road didn't just carry merchandise. It transported mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and art. The spread of Buddhism from India into China and beyond is one of the Silk Road's most profound legacies. Cities like Samarkand, Kashgar, and Dunhuang became cosmopolitan centers where languages mixed and temples stood side by side. Entire empires rose and fell around, controlling key stretches of the route. From the Parthians to the Sogdians to the Mongols, and then came the Black Death, likely carried along these same routes in the 14th century, reminding the world that trade also moves what we can't see. While the Silk Road carried caravans across mountains and deserts, the Indian Ocean offered a liquid superhighway, one that was faster, cheaper, and in many ways even more influential. By 1000 BCE, the Indian Ocean trade network was already humming with activity, connecting East Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and eventually China in a vast web of commerce and culture. Unlike the chaotic unpredictability of land routes, the Indian Ocean had a rhythm, the monsoons. These seasonal winds were predictable, one direction in summer, the opposite in winter. Skilled sailors learned to ride these wind cycles, allowing for planned round trips across vast distances. Thanks to the monsoon system, a merchant ship could sail from East Africa to India, load up with goods, and return months later with time to spare. What do they carry? Everything. From India, black pepper, cotton textiles, ivory carvings, and later sugar and indigo. From Arabia, frankincense, myrrh, horses, and dates. East Africa offered gold, slaves, and exotic animal products. Southeast Asia traded in spices, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon that were so valuable they could be worth more than gold per ounce. This wasn't just about raw materials, it was about ideas. Islam spread rapidly along these maritime routes, not by conquest, but by commerce. Muslim merchants established communities in Indian ports on the Swahili coast. And as far east as Indonesia, local rulers often converted for economic advantage, embedding religion into trade. Ports like Calicut, Zanzibar, and Malacca became multi-ethnic melting pots. You could hear Arabic, Tamil, Swahili, and Chinese spoken in a single market. These weren't backwaters. They were global hubs, centuries before globalization became a buzzword. Ship technology also advanced rapidly. The dhow, with its triangular sail, became the vessel of choice, agile and fast. Chinese junks, massive ships with multiple decks and watertight compartments, later joined the mix, especially under the voyages of Admiral Zheng He in the 15th century. What made the Indian Ocean trade special wasn't just its scale, but its collaboration. Unlike the territorial empires on land, the sea trade relied more on mutual benefit than brute force, at least until later European intervention. As trade routes matured, powerful empires began to realize something crucial. Controlling the road meant controlling the wealth. From the Persian Royal Road to Rome's stone highways to the mountainous trails of the Inca Empire, these overland routes became tools not just of commerce, but of dominance, diplomacy, and statecraft. Let's start with the Achaemenid Persians by the 5th century BCE. Their royal road stretched over 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis. It was the logistical backbone of their empire, allowing messengers, soldiers, and merchants to move rapidly across 3 continents. Stations were placed every few miles with fresh horses and guards. A royal courier could cover the entire road in just over a week, unheard of for the time. And along with messages, merchants flowed too, paying tolls that filled imperial coffers. Next came Rome, whose obsession with roads was legendary. All roads lead to Rome wasn't just a saying, it was policy. Roman roads were feats of engineering, laid with stone, cambered for drainage, and marked by milestones. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BCE, connected Rome to southern Italy and became the prototype for a network that eventually spanned over 250,000 miles. These roads allowed for fast troop deployment, tax collection, and yes, trade. Goods from the provinces flowed into the heart of the empire. Egyptian grain, Spanish silver, Syrian glass, and African ivory. Far across the ocean, another RD. The empire flourished, the Incas. Without wheels or horses, they built one of the most astonishing RD systems in the world, the Chapak Nayan, or Inca Road. Spanned over 24,000 miles through the Andes, it linked the empire's mountainous spine from Colombia to Chile. Runners called chasquis relayed messages and small goods across suspension bridges and steep cliffs. The Incas used llamas for transport and imposed strict control over who could use the road, ensuring state dominance over trade. In all these empires, roads weren't just about movement, they were about control. They allowed rulers to project power, enforce taxation, and regulate commerce. Traders used them, but always at the pleasure of the state. By the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval kingdoms, many ancient trade routes had decayed or been abandoned. Yet the desire for connection and profit never disappeared. In fact, the medieval period saw old routes revived and new ones forged by a surprising cast of characters: religious pilgrims, crusaders, merchant guilds, and ambitious city-states. Religion was a powerful motivator. Pilgrimage routes across Europe, like the Camino de Santiago, became arteries of movement. Pilgrims weren't just carrying faith, they carried money, supplies, stories, and even new ideas. Inns, markets, and towns grew along these sacred paths, and local economies boomed. Spiritual devotion kept people moving, and commerce followed. Meanwhile, Islamic empires to the east were thriving. The Abbasid Caliphate transformed cities like Baghdad and Damascus into glittering trade centers. Muslim merchants expanded trade into sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and even China, linking the Islamic world to the revived Silk Road. Arabic became the lingua franca of trade across 3 continents. In Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League emerged, a powerful alliance of merchant cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bruges. They controlled the flow of goods across the Baltic and North Seas, trading salt, furs, grain, and timber. With their own navy and legal systems, they weren't just traders, they were an economic superpower. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa took trade to the next level, positioned perfectly between East and West. They became middlemen for luxury goods arriving from Asia via the Eastern Mediterranean. Spices, silks, and precious stones flowed through their ports, enriching powerful merchant families like the Medicis. Then came the Crusades. While they failed to reclaim the Holy Land, they succeeded in reopening and expanding east-west connections. European crusaders returned not just with scars, but with silks, spices, and new appetites. The result? A booming demand for Eastern goods and renewed interest in the overland and maritime trade routes that could deliver them. Guilds emerged to protect local economies and standardize trade. Markets became fairs, fairs became towns, towns became cities. Trade wasn't just reviving, it was institutionalizing. By the late 15th century, the world was on the verge of a dramatic transformation. The age of ancient trade routes was giving way to a new era, one driven by sails, cannons, and global ambition. But the foundation for this seismic shift had been laid over millennia on the backs of camels, ox carts, and merchant ships guided by the stars. The explosion of maritime exploration, led by Portugal and Spain, was not the beginning of global trade, but its acceleration. Vasco da Gama's sea route to India in 1498 bypassed the land-based Silk Road entirely, undercutting Middle Eastern middlemen and redrawing the economic map. Suddenly, spices, silks, and porcelain flowed straight from Asia to Europe, faster, cheaper, and on a scale never before seen. Colonial empires soon followed. The Portuguese set up trading posts from Mozambique to Malacca. The Spanish sailed west and discovered the Americas, where gold and silver were extracted in vast quantities and shipped across oceans. The Dutch and English weren't far behind, founding East India companies that acted like governments, with armies, navies, and monopolies on entire trade networks. Ancient land routes like the Silk Road faded in importance, but their legacy endured in infrastructure, language, culture, and commerce. Trade hubs like Samarkand and Constantinople, though diminished, retained echoes of their former glory. New cities rose from their legacy: Amsterdam, London, and New York, built on the same principles of connectivity and commerce. Modern trade routes, railroads, highways, air corridors, and undersea cables still trace the patterns established by ancient traders. Globalization may be powered by algorithms and cargo ships today, but its DNA comes from Phoenician sea lanes, Roman roads, and Indian Ocean monsoons. And the influence isn't just economic ideas, religions, technologies, even diseases. All followed the trails of traders. The compass, the printing press, algebra, coffee, Buddhism. None of these spread without commerce. Trade didn't just move goods, it moved history. So next time you see a container ship glide across the ocean or a freight train rattle past, remember, it's not just steel and cargo. It's the echo of a Silk Road caravan, the shadow of a Phoenician galley, the pulse of humanity forever in motion, chasing not just profit but connection. Tulum is not your typical ancient Maya city. While most Maya centers are buried deep in the jungle, surrounded by dense forest and hidden temples, Tulum rises dramatically above the Caribbean Sea, perched on a limestone cliff overlooking turquoise waves. It's a postcard scene with a powerful history. A sacred coastal outpost that stood watch over both the land and the sea. Located on the eastern edge of the Yucatan Peninsula in what is now Quintana Roo, Mexico, Tulum was one of the last major cities built and inhabited by the Maya. Its peak came relatively late, between the 13th and 15th century CE, during the post-classic period, just before the Spanish arrival. But despite its late bloom, Tulum left an outsized mark on Maya history. Its name means wall in Yucatec Maya, a reference to the thick limestone barrier that encloses the city on three sides. The fourth side? That's the open Caribbean Sea, stretching endlessly eastward. This combination made Tulum uniquely defensible and symbolically significant. According to some accounts, the city may have originally been called Zamor, meaning City of the Dawn, likely in reference to its perfect alignment with the rising sun. From its cliffs, Maya lookouts could spot merchant canoes gliding in from Cuba, Belize, and even Honduras. Tulum was a key node in a complex maritime trade network, dealing in obsidian, jade, salt, honey, textiles, and dried fish. It connected inland cities like Coba and Chichen Itza to the sea, and its wealth flowed through both canoes and caravans. But Tulum wasn't just a trade hub, it was a spiritual stronghold. Every building, every platform, and every shrine was carefully positioned, many aligned with celestial bodies or sacred dates in the Maya calendar. It was a city that watched the sky as much as the surf, and even after the Spanish arrived and the city was eventually abandoned, Tulum was never truly forgotten. Its ruins remain visible from the sea, a haunting reminder to passing sailors of a civilization that charted the stars long before Europeans arrived. Tulum may appear small compared to Maya giants like Chichen Itza or Tikal, but its compactness is deceptive. Every structure within its stone walls was placed with purpose, guided by astronomy, spiritual belief, and strategic design. This wasn't just a city, it was a cosmic map carved into stone at its core too. Tulum's layout reflects a balance between the earthly and the celestial. The city is surrounded on three sides by thick defensive walls, each up to 5 meters thick and 3 meters high. A clear statement that Tulum was as concerned with protection as it was with worship. But within those walls lies a careful arrangement of temples, altars, and platforms that are aligned with the heavens. The centerpiece of the city is El Castillo, not a castle in European sense, but a temple pyramid that dominates the skyline. Built on a cliff edge, it served both as a religious shrine and a lighthouse for Maya sailors. When the sun rises directly behind it during key times of the year, it lights the facade in perfect symmetry. Some scholars believe it was used to track the solstices and equinoxes, allowing the Maya to align their rituals with the rhythms of the cosmos. Next to El Castillo is the Temple of the Descending God, named for the carved figure above its doorway, a figure with wings and an inverted posture believed to represent a celestial or fertility deity. This temple faces W, catching the sunset and perhaps symbolizing the transition from day to night, life to death. Key themes in Maya spirituality. Many buildings are constructed on raised platforms and are oriented along precise axes, often northeast, southwest, or east-west. These were not arbitrary choices. They echo the Maya obsession with tracking Venus, the sun, and the lunar cycle. Even doorways and windows seem to frame celestial events at certain times of the year. Tulum's planners didn't just design a defensible city, they designed a spiritual calendar in stone. It was a place where architecture, astronomy, and mythology merged into daily life, rising above the turquoise sea like a silent sentinel. El Castillo is Tulum's most iconic structure. Positioned at the edge of a limestone cliff, it commands not just the coastline, but the heavens, a fusion of engineering, astronomy, and sacred symbolism. Though not as massive as the Great Pyramids of inland Maya cities, El Castillo was never meant to compete in size. It was meant to signal. Built in stages, El Castillo likely served multiple roles: temple, shrine, watchtower, and possibly even lighthouse. During the day, its high elevation and stark stone facade made it visible from far out at sea. For Maya sailors navigating the Caribbean in large dugout canoes, El Castillo marked both a physical and spiritual harbor, a beacon of protection under the watch of the gods. But it wasn't just a daytime guide. At night, fires may have been lit within the temple atop the structure. Paired with small windows and aligned with seaward gaps in the reef, the glow could be used to help mariners safely reach Tulum's shore through narrow breaks in the coral. This would make El Castillo one of the earliest examples of a lighthouse-like structure in the Americas. Religiously, El Castillo was likely dedicated to the diving god or the descending god, a celestial figure connected to Venus, a planet that played a central role in Maya cosmology. The Maya believed Venus influenced warfare, agriculture, and the calendar. Structures like El Castillo were used to track its appearances in the sky. During specific dates in the solar and Venusian calendars, the sun would rise or set directly in line with the temple, bathing it in radiant light, a moment of cosmic synchronization. The temple itself is modest in size, but elevated for maximum visibility. Its stairways and niches suggest rituals were held atop, where priests performed ceremonies visible from the plaza and coastline below. Unlike massive ceremonial complexes inland, El Castillo wasn't about grandeur. It was about function, guiding ships, channeling solar energy, and connecting the sea with the sky. Tucked near the center of Tulum's ceremonial core is one of its most fascinating and spiritually charged buildings, the Temple of the Frescoes. Unlike the imposing height of El Castillo, this structure draws the eye not through scale, but through detail. It's a multi-level temple complex rich with symbolism, iconography, and some of the finest surviving Maya murals on the Yucatan coast. The temple served a dual purpose as a shrine and as an observatory. The upper level likely functioned as a ritual space for priests, while the lower chamber housed painted murals and stone carvings that brought the Maya cosmos to life. Though weather and time have eroded many of the original pigments, enough detail remains to offer a stunning glimpse into Maya's spiritual thought. Inside, the frescoes depict a pantheon of gods, deities, and supernatural creatures. Most prominent among them is the descending god, often shown upside down, a rare and intriguing figure in Maya art. This god, associated with Venus, fertility, and possibly bees, appears in multiple places throughout Tulum, reinforcing his importance to the city's identity. The murals also show scenes of creation, underworld journeys, and cosmic battles. Sky bands, earth monsters, and celestial symbols swirl together in a painted narrative that reflects the Maya view of a multi-layered universe. For the Maya, the world was divided into three parts: the heavens above, the earthly realm, and the watery underworld below, all of which appear in these frescoes in striking visual form. On the exterior, the temple is adorned with stucco masks and niches. Some of these likely held offerings or small idols. Columns support the portico, giving the structure an almost Greco-Maya appearance, a rare architectural feature in this region. Astronomically, the Temple of the Frescoes is thought to have been aligned with key solar events. Windows and sight lines may have marked solstices or equinoxes, helping priests maintain the sacred calendar. It was both a house of worship and a timekeeping device, as functional as it was beautiful. Among Tulum's sacred structures, none is more enigmatic than the Temple of the Descending God. Modest in scale but rich in symbolism, this temple is dedicated to one of the most mysterious deities in the Maya pantheon. A figure depicted upside down, wings or headdress flared, descending from the heavens. His image appears throughout Tulum, suggesting a guardian presence, a celestial overseer of the city perched between sea and sky. Located just to the west of El Castillo, the temple stands atop a small platform. It features a single-room sanctuary with a narrow stairway and a prominent niche above the doorway, and there in the niche is the defining element, a stucco relief of the descending god, head first, knees bent, arms outstretched, as though mid-flight or mid-fall. No one knows his true name, but scholars have linked him to Kinnicha, the sun god, or possibly to a bee deity revered for its role in pollination and honey production essential elements in Maya agriculture and ritual. The descending posture is rare in Maya art and architecture. Typically, deities are shown upright, enthroned, or in combat, but here the inverted figure suggests a spiritual inversion, a messenger between worlds bringing divine influence down into the human realm. Some interpretations connect him to Venus, the morning star, a powerful celestial body in Maya astronomy associated with cycles of war, rebirth, and sacrifice. The temple itself is aligned to capture the light of the setting sun, creating a dramatic visual spectacle during certain times of the year. This alignment may have signaled ritual dates or seasonal transitions. For Tulum's priests, such moments weren't just beautiful, they were divine appointments. Inside, the temple would have held offerings, incense burners, and possibly the ashes or bones of elite individuals. Though small, it was a site of intense spiritual significance, a space to commune with the sky, interpret omens, and perform rites under the watching gaze of the descending god. This figure, with wings spread and body inverted, became a symbol of Tulum itself, a city that stood on the edge of land between sky and sea, at the turning point of the calendar and the cosmos. While Tulum is celebrated for its temples and astronomical alignments, its physical defenses tell a different kind of story, one of protection, strategy, and geopolitical awareness. Unlike most ancient Maya cities, which sprawled openly across the landscape, Tulum was built like a fortress. 3 massive stone walls encircle the inland sides of the city, while the fourth edge ends in a sheer cliff above the Caribbean Sea. It wasn't just sacred, it was secure. The walls are impressive even today, up to 5 meters thick and as high as 5 meters in some places, with narrow passageways that could easily be defended. These weren't symbolic boundaries. They were practical military installations built to repel raiders, pirates, or rival city-states. The entrances were small and few, forcing any intruder to enter a single file, vulnerable and exposed. Strategically placed along the perimeter were watchtowers, squat, round buildings with small windows or slits that offered clear lines of sight over the land and sea. From here, guards could spot approaching canoes long before they reached shore. These towers may have also doubled as communication points, using smoke or fire signals to alert the city's elite of any threat or arrival. But these defenses also had a spiritual dimension to the Maya. Walls didn't just keep enemies out. They separated the sacred from the profane. Inside the walls was holy space, where temples aligned with the cosmos, rituals echoed the stars, and every step was watched by the gods. Outside was the wilderness, the unknown, and the unstable world of politics and warfare. The positioning of Tulum also gave it incredible control over both land and sea roads. It lay along the Maya coastal trade network, a major artery for goods moving up and down the Yucatan Peninsula. Salt, honey, jade, obsidian, and cacao passed through its gates. Any merchant sailing the coast would see Tulum's cliffside silhouette long before they reached it, a reminder of its power and protection. In Tulum, strength and sanctity were never far apart, long before colonial ports and international harbors. Tulum was a thriving maritime trading post, a coastal checkpoint that linked inland Maya cities with the Caribbean world. Its location wasn't chosen for beauty alone. Strategically perched above the sea with access to sheltered landing beaches, Tulum was built to connect. The Maya were expert seafarers. They carved massive dugout canoes from saber trees, some large enough to carry 20 to 30 people and hundreds of pounds of cargo. These vessels paddled up and down the Yucatan coastline, traveling as far as modern-day Honduras to the south and the Gulf Coast to the north. With prevailing currents and consistent trade winds, Maya merchants followed well-established maritime routes that turned Tulum into a key stop. Goods flowed in from every direction. From the inland highlands came obsidian, jade, and cacao, valuable items used in ritual and elite exchange from coastal regions. Merchants brought salt, dried fish, cotton textiles, honey, feathers, and shells. Tulum didn't produce all of these items itself. Instead, it served as a distribution point where goods could be stored, taxed, and redirected along the network. What made Tulum unique was its combination of sea access and defensive structure. Unlike open coastal towns, Tulum had walls. This meant not just protection from raiders, but also control over who came in and out. Goods were monitored, Elites collected tribute, and priests likely blessed the transactions, reinforcing the idea that trade and ritual were closely intertwined in Maya society. Foreign merchants may have passed through as well. Some ceramic styles and imported objects suggest contact with other Mesoamerican peoples, including those from central Mexico and the Gulf Coast. Tulum was not isolated. It was plugged into a regional system that pulsed with economic, cultural, and spiritual energy. Canoes likely pulled into small landing beaches just below the cliffs, where goods were offloaded and carried up into the city. From there, they could be exchanged, stored, or carried inland by human porters to major cities like Khobar. Tulum was a crossroads not just of geography, but of identity. For centuries, Tulum thrived as a sacred stronghold and bustling trade port. But like all great cities, its dominance eventually faded. By the time the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, Tulum was still standing, but already in decline. Its walls remained intact, its temples still visible from the sea, but its golden age was clearly behind it. So what happened? Tulum's decline was likely gradual, not catastrophic. There's no evidence of war or violent destruction, no signs of mass fire or invasion. Instead, it seems the city slowly lost its strategic importance. As trade networks shifted and larger inland centers like Chichen Itzar and Mayapan rose and fell, Tulum's influence began to wane. The economic arteries that once flowed through its gates may have rerouted elsewhere. There's also the broader context of Maya civilization. By the late post-classic period, many Maya cities were already experiencing political fragmentation, shifting alliances and declining populations. Environmental stresses, including droughts and soil exhaustion, likely contributed to the instability across the Yucatan. These factors would have rippled out to Tulum, even if it was more coastal and less dependent on agriculture. Then came the Spanish in 1518. Spanish explorer Juan de Grijalva sailed past Tulum. His crew noted the city's tall stone buildings and imposing walls. They were struck by its scale and structure. A few years later, during Hernán Cortés' expedition to Honduras, the Spanish again passed by Tulum, remarking on its beauty and the towering temple that stood like a sentinel over the sea. But they did not stop to conquer it. Not right away. By the end of the 16th century, however, Tulum was abandoned. Whether through disease, disruption of trade, or the cultural upheaval brought by colonization and Christianity, its people gradually left. What remained were empty temples, wind-worn walls, and the echo of rituals once performed beneath the stars. Yet Tulum never fully disappeared. Unlike many jungle-wrapped Maya ruins, it stood exposed, visible from the water, a ghost city on the cliff. Sailors passed it for centuries, its silhouette a marker of a world that had slipped into memory. Long after its last incense burned and its final traders departed, Tulum stood silent above the sea, not lost but waiting. Unlike jungle cities like Palenque or Calakmul, Tulum was never completely buried. Its cliffside perch kept it visible to sailors and locals alike. But it wasn't until the 19th century that it re-entered the world's historical imagination. In 1842, two explorers, John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood, arrived in Tulum during their now famous expedition through the Maya world. Stephens, an American diplomat, and Catherwood, a British artist, were among the first Europeans to document the ruins in detail. Catherwood's illustrations of El Castillo and the Temple of the Descending God mesmerized European readers, and Tulum quickly gained fame as one of the most photogenic and accessible Maya sites. Archaeological work increased in the 20th century. The Mexican government began preservation efforts, stabilizing structures and clearing vegetation. Unlike deeper jungle ruins, Tulum was relatively easy to access and soon became a popular destination, not just for historians, but for tourists, photographers, and spiritual seekers today. Tulum is one of the most visited archaeological sites in Mexico. Thousands walk through its stone gates each day, past temples that once aligned with the stars and walls that once defended sacred ground. Visitors stand where Maya priests once charted Venus in the sky, and where sailors once saw the city emerge like a vision from the waves. Yet the real magic of Tulum lies in what it continues to reveal. New studies are using LiDAR scanning and satellite mapping to uncover more about the site's original layout, and its connections to inland cities like Kober. Scholars are still debating the true identity of the descending god, the precise function of El Castillo, and the exact reasons for the city's fall. But beyond the questions, Tulum remains a symbol of Maya resilience, architectural genius, and cosmic curiosity. It reminds us that ancient people weren't isolated in the past. They navigated oceans, tracked stars, built observatories, and structured cities around cycles larger than themselves. Tulum isn't just ruins on a cliff. It's a living testament to a civilization that saw the universe as something to align with, not conquer. And that vision still echoes every time the rising sun spills across the stone. Imagine you're a peasant in 13th century Europe. You've been working the fields since sunrise. You're caked in mud, your back hurts, and you're parched. But instead of reaching for a glass of water, you do something your modern descendants would find deeply alarming. You reach for a tankard of ale, and not because you're trying to get tipsy. No, it's because water could kill you. Medieval people had healthy, well-earned paranoia of untreated water. Rivers and wells were convenient dumping grounds for sewage, dead animals, and the occasional unlucky traveler. Germ theory didn't exist yet, but people had figured it out through trial. And the very unfortunate error that drinking straight from the stream was a shortcut to spending the night with your face in a ditch or in a shallow grave. The solution? Small beer, a low-alcohol, mildly fermented drink made from grains, barley, and whatever yeast happened to be floating around. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't strong, but it was safer than the plague-ridden puddle outside. Children drank it. Nuns drank it. Even monks drank it, though to be fair, they probably had better stuff. The average medieval person consumed about a gallon of ale per day. That's right, a gallon. Not because they were all raging alcoholics, though let's be honest somewhere, but because they genuinely didn't trust water. It was also cheaper and easier to produce than wine, especially in Northern Europe. In many places, ale wasn't just a drink, it was a food group. A calorie delivery system in a cup. Liquid bread, if you will, and far less chewable than the moldy stuff the local miller passed off as food. And no, people weren't staggering around drunk all day. The alcohol content in small beer was usually 1 to 2%, just enough to kill bacteria, not enough to start a tavern brawl before breakfast. But if you drank too much, especially on an empty stomach, things got wobbly. While peasants were chugging low-grade ale to avoid dying from swamp water, monks were doing something a little more refined, inventing medieval craft beer. Yes, in between chanting, copying manuscripts, and regretting their celibacy, monks were quietly becoming the OG brewmasters of Europe. Far from being casual drinkers, they ran full-on brewing operations in their monasteries, and they were good at it. Really good. Why monks? Well, monasteries were clean, relatively stable, and full of men with time, literacy, and access to big pots. Brewing became part of the monastic routine, just like praying, fasting, and passive-aggressively judging each other's handwriting. They brewed for guests, for pilgrims, for charity, and, of course, for themselves. Let's not pretend Brother Pius wasn't sneaking a pint between Vespers and Matins. They also perfected recipes. Unlike peasants who just tossed grains in a pot and hoped for the best, monks documented everything. They measured ingredients. They timed fermentation. They even introduced hops to the process. Yes, hops, the plant that gives beer its bitterness and lets you pretend your IPA addiction is sophisticated. And while regular folks were drinking small beer, monks brewed stronger stuff. Why? Because they could also. Because during fasting periods, solid food was banned, but beer wasn't. This brilliant theological loophole gave rise to what monks lovingly called liquid bread. It had calories. It had flavor. It had alcohol. What more does a cloistered man need? Some monasteries got so good at it that their beer became famous across regions. Townspeople would visit the abbey not for spiritual enlightenment, but for booze. By the 14th century, many monasteries were running what we'd now call microbreweries. Except instead of a guy named Chad in a flannel shirt, it was Brother Gregory with a tonsure and impeccable fermentation notes. Monastic beer became a brand. Even today, several beers still carry names tied to old monasteries, proving that holy men really understood the sacred relationship between man and monk. Before Instagram, before Facebook, and long before you could ruin your reputation with a tweet. There were taverns, and in medieval times, taverns were where everything happened. Weddings were planned there. Deals were made there. Fights broke out there. And yes, people got properly, gloriously, biblically drunk there. Taverns were the medieval answer to both the office and the town square. You went there to hear news, gossip about your neighbors, argue about taxes, and occasionally find out if someone had been secretly excommunicated. It was basically a medieval Reddit thread, except with more beer and slightly fewer trolls. Slightly. The interior was simple, a dirt or straw covered floor, rough wooden benches, an open hearth, and a tavern keeper who may or may not have cleaned the mugs this week. The air was thick with smoke, garlic, and regret, and on busy nights you might find traveling musicians, dice games, or an impromptu pig auction taking place between rounds. The drink menu? Modest, usually ale, maybe cider, and if you were lucky or rich, a bit of wine. But no one came for the variety. They came for the chaos. And in a society where most people worked from dawn to dusk in backbreaking conditions, a tavern was more than a drinking hole. It was a pressure valve. It's also where social boundaries are blurred temporarily. In the tavern, peasants could bump shoulders with merchants. Clergy might share a bench with a town blacksmith, and occasionally someone might start speaking Latin after 2 cups, and no one would stop them. Everyone was equal under ale until someone knocked over a jug. Then all hell broke loose. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Church leaders complained that taverns were dens of sin, and city councils tried regulating them with about as much success as regulating pigeons. But the truth was simple. Taverns were essential. They kept communities together, let steam blow off, and gave people a place to lose arguments, money, and memory all in one night in medieval Europe. How drunk you got and how much dignity you lost in the process often depended on your social class, because getting wasted wasn't a one-size-fits-all experience. It came in tiers like a really unstable wedding cake with a goat sleeping under it. Let's start at the bottom. The peasant. Your average village laborer drank small beer or weak cider throughout the day. Not to party, but to stay alive. It was a calorie source, a water substitute, and frankly, one of the few affordable pleasures in a life full of blisters and taxes. Peasants drank from wooden cups, clay jugs, or if things got really desperate, their hands. Getting wasted wasn't always the goal. But on feast days, you could count on someone waking up in a haystack with no memory and someone else's shoe. Now slide up the muddy social ladder to the nobility. Here, alcohol was about status. Nobles drank wine, ideally imported, absurdly expensive, and served in a goblet that could double as a helmet. Wine was often sweetened, spiced, or perfumed because nothing says power like drinking something that smells like your grandmother's closet. Feasts in noble courts were liquid marathons, multiple courses, endless refills, and toasts that went on so long you could grow a beard mid-sentence. Getting drunk at court was common, even expected, but it had to be done gracefully. Slurred Latin and wine-stained robes? Forgivable. Throwing up on the bishop's lap? Slightly less so. Then there were the monks and clergy floating in their own bubble. Technically celibate, occasionally sober. Monasteries brewed beer, but the priests drank wine for sacramental purposes, of course, which is a polite way of saying they were usually tipsy by vespers. But whether peasant or noble, the one universal rule was don't waste it. Alcohol was valuable. Every drop came from labor, fermented, stored and hauled by someone who'd rather be napping. You drank what you had, and you respected it. Or you got in a fight with the baker and ended up in the stocks. Drinking was the medieval equalizer. It dulled misery for the poor and inflated egos for the rich. Everyone got something out of it. Some got hangover, some got legends. So you might be wondering, what exactly did medieval people drink when they wanted to unwind, or just survive another day of plowing, plague, or papal taxes? Let's begin with ale, the true backbone of the medieval beverage lineup. It was unfiltered, uncarbonated, and often thick enough to chew. Brewed from barley, oats, or whatever grain hadn't been stolen by rats that week. Ale came in multiple strengths. Small beer, light, regular ale, buzzworthy, and the kind that made you see angels or start reciting poetry. sometimes both. Next was mead, the drink of choice for those who wanted to feel a bit mythological. Made from fermented honey and water, it was sweet, strong, and popular at feasts, or among people who thought regular beer just wasn't theatrical enough. If ale was the village plumber, mead was the bard with the lute and questionable eye contact. Then came wine, mostly for the rich, the monks, and anyone living in southern Europe where grapes were more plentiful than morels. But medieval wine was a far cry from your modern Merlot. It was often sour, weak, and routinely mixed with herbs, spices, or even seawater. Yes, seawater. Nothing says I'm classy like sipping a Cabernet that tastes like brine and regret. You also had cider and perry, fermented apple or pear drinks popular in orchard regions. Sweet, fizzy-ish, and dangerously easy to overdrink, especially if you were already 2 tankards deep into your no-work-today plan. And then, things got weird. Some folks drank braggart, a medieval hybrid of beer and mead, usually strong enough to peel paint. Others enjoyed posset, a bizarre hot mixture of curdled milk and ale. Picture a foamy soup made by someone who's angry at cows. Occasionally, medicinal concoctions came into play. Herb-infused wines that promised to cure everything from headaches to demons. Whether they actually cured anything is questionable. But after 3 cups, no one cared. And finally, there was ale mixed with raw egg for the brave and the soon-to-be nauseous. Did it help with strength? Maybe. Did it smell like something you'd regret? Absolutely. If you think medieval people drank a lot during regular days, you should see them at a feast. These weren't your grandma's polite dinners. They were all-night carnivals of consumption. Meat, music, merriment, and massive quantities of booze. And getting drunk wasn't just accepted. It was basically built into the seating arrangement. Feasts happened for any occasion: weddings, holidays, the birth of a royal heir, the return of someone who hadn't died from crusading, or just because the Lord was bored and wanted to show off his new goblet shaped like a falcon. The drinking began early. Wine or strong ale was poured by the gallon, and guests were expected to participate enthusiastically. Refusing a toast could be seen as rude, suspicious, or even unpatriotic. In some courts, it was practically treason. Toasts weren't just cheers. They were elaborate rituals with speeches, blessings, and the occasional passive-aggressive poem. And every toast was followed by more food, more drink, and usually more bad decisions. Nobles drank from ornate cups, gold, silver, sometimes carved horn, because even intoxication had to be a performance. Meanwhile, servants scurried around, refilling mugs, clearing trenches, aka edible plates made of stale bread, and quietly judging everyone. As the evening dragged on and inhibitions vanished, the party often devolved into a blur of singing, wrestling, and long-winded storytelling no one asked for. There are medieval records of people dueling mid-feast over who told a better joke, or whose beard had more dignity. And then came the entertainers, minstrels, dancers, jugglers, or that one guy who made inappropriate shadow puppets after too much mead, all fueled by the same overflowing pictures. If things went well, you left wobbling, full of roast goose and good cheer. If they went poorly, you woke up under the table next to a jester and a broken lute, swearing you'd never drink again. Until next week, feasts were structured chaos, and alcohol, it was the social glue and the accelerant. If you thought beer pong was the peak of human civilization, allow me to introduce you to the chaotic world of medieval drinking games, where the stakes were high, the rules were vague, and the chance of injury hovered somewhere around absolutely. Getting wasted wasn't just a side effect of medieval socializing, it was the main event, and games helped move things along. These weren't structured contests with scorecards. No, these were activities that started with laughter and ended with someone passed out in the turnip bin. One of the most common pastimes, toasting wars. 2 or more people would try to out-toast each other, not in clever words, but in sheer volume. It was less about poetry and more about surviving round after round without slurring through the words to the king's goat. Another classic was casting the dice, often played for drinks, coins, or questionable favors. The dice were crude, often carved from bone, and the rules changed depending on who was sober enough to explain them. And if the game ended in an accusation of cheating, well, congratulations, you just invented medieval bar fighting, which we'll cover later. There was also who can drink the most the fastest. Not a creative name, but extremely popular. This was less about winning and more about achieving bragging rights and possibly liver failure. Medieval men prided themselves on how many tankards they could down before falling into a hedge. In noble circles, drinking games were wrapped in rituals and manners, like courtly pledges. A lady might challenge a knight to drink a full goblet in her honor, a task he'd accept dramatically, possibly while composing a short epic poem, and trying not to belch through the rhyming couplets. And of course, there were games with physical consequences, balance contests, spinning challenges, and impromptu wrestling. Once someone mistook the minstrel for an ogre, the point was never really to win. The point was to drink more, laugh harder, and test the durability of the local furniture. In medieval Europe, drinking wasn't just socially acceptable, it was theologically endorsed. The church may have wagged its finger at taverns and bar fights, but when it came to wine, that was holy business. Let's start with the basics. Communion wine. At every Mass, the priest would lift the chalice, say a few sacred words, and boom, it was now the literal blood of Christ. And then he drank it, often several times a week, sometimes daily. No, it's not like priests were doing keg stands in a cathedral, but the ritual meant a steady, respectable intake of wine, all in the name of salvation. And wine wasn't reserved just for communion. Monasteries produced barrels of the stuff, technically for religious use, but somehow always with enough left over for, let's say, personal reflection. Monks documented their vintages and praised the divine quality of fermentation, and occasionally ended sermons a bit slurred. Then you had saints, who were practically the patron protectors of partying. Steve. Bridget of Ireland once prayed for a lake of beer for the heavenly host. And yes, that's a real quote. St. Arnold of Soissons is said to have saved thousands by urging people to drink beer instead of water during a plague. Science. No. Accidentally correct. Absolutely. Even religious festivals doubled as excuses to drink Christmas. Easter Saints' days. They weren't just for praying. They were for feasting, singing, and warming your soul and bloodstream with ale or mead. Pilgrims often stopped at monasteries where monks offered hospitality in the form of bread, shelter, and just enough wine to make the next leg of the journey spiritually questionable. And if you passed out under the altar table, well, you were just resting in the presence of the Lord, of course. The church condemned excessive drinking, but like most medieval rules, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. A noble might get a stern sermon. A peasant might get tossed in the stocks. A monk, he'd just get reassigned to less liquid duties. Let's be honest, in a world where beer was safer than water, someone was always bound to overdo it. And while medieval society loved a good feast and a bit of booze-fueled cheer, there was a limit. Once you crossed the line from merrily tipsy to shouting at goats and trying to joust a fence, that's when the town stocks came into play. Yes, the dreaded stocks, medieval society's favorite blend of punishment and public entertainment. These wooden contraptions clamped your ankles, wrists, or neck and left you stuck in the village square, exposed to the elements, hecklers, and occasionally a very disappointed sheep. Getting put in the stocks for public drunkenness wasn't rare. If you were loud, rude, vomited somewhere sacred or strategic, or decided to moon a local bishop, you might find yourself clamped into public humiliation by dawn. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was deeply social. Your friends, neighbors, and that one nosy blacksmith's wife all got to watch you squirm, stew, and sober up slowly in full daylight. Children might throw old vegetables. Monks might mutter scripture at you. Someone would definitely say, "Seen that one before." Ironically, you weren't always punished for drinking, only for being bad at it. Nobles could drink themselves into a coma at feasts with no consequences. But if a cobbler tripped into a pig trough after 3 Alash, suddenly it was a moral crisis. Authorities saw public drunkenness as dangerous, not because of the alcohol itself, but because it made people unpredictable. Slurred speech and stumbling were fine behind closed doors, but out in the streets, that's how revolts start. Or worse, folk songs. Some towns even had ale tasters whose job was to make sure tavern beer wasn't too strong, or at least not stronger than the mayor's tolerance. Still, being drunk in public was rarely treated as a crime. It was a mild disgrace, a social slap on the wrist. You weren't a criminal, just someone who got a little too medieval on a Wednesday night. And after a few hours in the stocks, you walked away stiff, shamed, and probably planning your next visit to the tavern. Just quieter this time. Hangovers in the Middle Ages were exactly as awful as you'd expect. minus the ibuprofen and minus any sympathy from your neighbors. You wake up on a pile of straw. The church bells are going off like Judgment Day, and there's a goat staring at you because apparently you passed out in its stall again. So what did medieval people do for hangovers? Well, for starters, they powered through it. You had chores. You had obligations. You didn't have time to complain about your head splitting open like a rotting melon. You just muttered something about sin and staggered back into the daylight. But some people, bless them, did try actual cures. One popular one, raw eggs and ale, because nothing says recovery like mixing what wrecked you with what might give you salmonella. Others swore by vinegar or fennel tea or infused herbs, which usually tasted like grass and sadness. If you were lucky enough to have access to a doctor, and I use that term loosely, they'd talk about imbalance. Balanced humors and probably bleed you a little. Nothing helps a hangover like blood loss, right? Some just kept drinking. That's not a joke. The hair of the dog wasn't invented yesterday. Medieval folks figured, well, I already feel like death. Might as well top it off with a warm mug of redemption. The church, predictably, had a different take. Hangovers weren't just your body punishing you. They were God punishing you. The prescription was repentance. And maybe fasting. Nothing cures a headache like guilt and a dry crust of bread. Honestly, most people probably didn't call it a hangover. They just called it Thursday. But make no mistake, getting wasted in medieval times had consequences. The difference is you couldn't tweet about it. You just got up, wiped the ale crust off your face, and hoped nobody remembered what you did with that loot. At some point in history, someone invented alcohol. And about 5 minutes later, someone else got punched in the face with a mug. Welcome to the chaotic world of medieval bar fights, where your honor, your drink, and your questionable singing voice could all get you into trouble. Taverns were not quiet places. They were loud, smoky, smelly, and usually packed to the rafters with people who'd spent all day digging trenches, shoeing horses, or arguing with their landlord, and were now 3 Alish deep and feeling bold. Arguments started over just about anything. Spilled drinks, unpaid debts, dice games gone wrong, who had the better beard, who insulted whose ox, and occasionally because someone thought the other guy looked too French. That was an actual insult in certain towns. Weapons weren't supposed to be brought into taverns, but let's be honest, this rule was as effective as modern no-smoking signs in 1990s bars. Daggers, clubs, even walking sticks could turn into weapons if the argument got heated enough. And if you didn't have a weapon, no problem. Tankards were heavy, and so were wooden stools. Tavern brawls ranged from quick shoving matches to full-blown furniture, destroying chaos. Sometimes the tavern keepers stepped in. Sometimes they just watched from a distance, arms crossed, calculating how many tables they'd need to fix in the morning. Local authorities usually didn't care unless someone died, or unless someone important got bruised. If it was just 2 peasants swinging wildly in the corner while a lute player kept strumming in denial, it was basically a Friday night. But if a noble or a visiting merchant got involved, suddenly the law showed up and stocks were prepared. Or worse, you were fined a month's wages and banned from the tavern, which was basically medieval exile, despite the risks. Fighting was part of tavern culture. You went in for a drink and a laugh. Sometimes you get both. Sometimes you got a black eye and a story you weren't allowed to tell around your grandmother. Medieval drinking wasn't just a man's game. In fact, if you walked into a tavern or bought ale from the corner stall, there was a good chance a woman had brewed it, sold it, and maybe poured it on your head if you got mouthy. Enter the alewife. One of the most common and underappreciated figures in medieval booze culture. Alewives weren't just women who brewed beer. They were the primary brewers for centuries. Brewing was considered domestic work, like baking or churning butter, except it could get you tipsy and occasionally cursed out by hungover blacksmiths. These women brewed small batches of ale at home, then sold it out of jugs, windows, or tiny stalls called tippling houses. Some operated out of their kitchens, others ran full on public ale houses. And yes, they could get in trouble, especially if their ale was too strong, too weak, or mysteriously made people hallucinate and fight chickens. Alewives were expected to follow local brewing laws, which changed depending on the town, the year, or the mood of the inspector. Prices were fixed by law, which meant if an alewife overcharged or watered down her product, she could be fined, publicly shamed, or forced to wear a paper hat declaring bad brewer. Yes, really. Then there were tavern maids who worked inside the alehouses, pouring drinks, scrubbing tables, and trying not to get groped by guys named Oswald with 3 teeth and too much meat in his system. These women had to be tough, fast, and fluent in insults. Some were just trying to earn a wage. Others flirted their way to better tips. A few married rich drunks and retired early, the medieval dream. But women weren't just behind the bar. They drank too, especially at festivals of weddings or after dealing with 8 children and a cow that refused to cooperate. Drunkenness wasn't praised in women, but it wasn't unheard of either. And if the ale was good and the night was long, a few verses of bawdy song were absolutely fair game in the Middle Ages if you were sick, injured, or just looked mildly uncomfortable. Someone was going to hand you alcohol. Maybe it was a priest. Maybe it was your barber surgeon. Maybe it was your grandmother. But rest assured, the medieval solution to almost anything was have a drink. And to be fair, it sometimes helped. Not because alcohol cured anything, but because when you're dizzy, feverish, or bleeding from a jousting mishap, a few cups of wine could take the edge off. Welcome to medieval medicine, where alcohol was painkiller, antiseptic, sedative, and occasionally breakfast. Doctors, and again that term's doing a lot of heavy lifting, routinely prescribed wine and ale. If you had a cold, warm wine, a headache, wine with mint, digestive issues, meat mixed with herbs, serve in what was essentially a hollowed-out medieval mug and a prayer. Even monks brewed herbal liqueurs for healing purposes. These were strong, sweet, syrupy concoctions flavored with wormwood, sage, or whatever looked vaguely medicinal in the garden. Today we call that digestive. Back then they called it medicine and just hoped you didn't die. One particularly bold remedy involved soaking herbs in brandy, then drinking it to cleanse the humors. Whether it cleansed anything other than your self-respect is debatable. But you did stop complaining, either from numbness or unconsciousness. In battlefield medicine, alcohol had a real purpose. It cleaned wounds. Or more accurately, it stung like hell and distracted you from the guy sawing off your leg with something that used to be a farming tool. Sometimes they gave the patient a strong drink before the amputation. Sometimes they were patient and just passed around the bottle. But medieval people didn't just use alcohol for injuries. It was prescribed for melancholy, plague symptoms, childbirth, recovery, and spiritual despair. If you were breathing, there was probably a bottle involved. Did it work? Occasionally. Did it make things worse? Also occasionally. But hey, in an age where bloodletting was considered science and leeches were practically co-workers, alcohol was at least pleasantly raw. If there's one thing governments have always been good at, it's noticing when people are having fun, and figuring out how to tax it. And in medieval Europe, alcohol was no exception. Drinking wasn't just a pastime, it was an economic engine. Brewing, selling, and serving alcohol created jobs, generated revenue, and gave local authorities yet another excuse to write unnecessarily dramatic laws. Some towns even had aliconers, official taste testers who checked whether the beer was good, legal, and appropriately frothy. Not a bad gig, assuming you didn't mind gout. Taverns needed licenses to operate, though what counted as a license varied wildly. In some places, it was a stamped document. In others, it was just a verbal agreement with the local bailiff and a sack of onions as collateral. But if you served ale without permission, you could be fined, shamed, or shut down faster than a poorly played lute solo. Prices were also regulated. That's right, price caps on beer. Authorities posted ale prices on wooden boards, and alewives or tavern keepers who charged too much were punished, in theory. In practice, if your ale was strong and your cousin worked at the mayor's office, things got flexible. And then came the taxes. Ale taxes, wine taxes, malt taxes. In some places, there were even drinking vessel taxes. Imagine getting fined for using a cup that was too fancy. Welcome to medieval capitalism. Monasteries and nobles often had tax exemptions, of course, because nothing says divinely inspired like not paying duties on your barrels of mead. Meanwhile, peasants were stuck paying levies on every batch they brewed for family gatherings, even if it tasted like watery sadness. But these regulations didn't stop people from drinking. They just made them more creative. Some taverns operated unofficially, some brewers sold off the record, and others simply bribed the right people and hoped no one checked the ledgers too closely. The result? A booming, slightly illegal, ale-soaked economy built on loopholes, gossip, and the unshakable human desire to have a pint at the end of a long day. In short, medieval booze wasn't just social, it was business. And business was booming. By the end of the medieval period, the way people drank and what they drank started to shift slowly, subtly, and with far fewer pigs in taverns. One major change came with the rise of stronger alcohol. Distillation, that magical process that turns wine into something that could clean wounds and erase memories, became more refined in the late Middle Ages. This gave birth to early versions of brandy, aquavita, water of life, and other dangerously potent drinks that made beer look like toddler juice. At the same time, international trade expanded. Exotic spices, new brewing techniques, and eventually sugar and rum made their way into Europe. With every shipload of imported goods, drinking culture evolved. Mead and ale began to lose ground to wine and spirits, especially among the wealthy, who now wanted to sip imported claret and pretend they were part of the Renaissance. Taverns also got an upgrade. By the 16th century, some evolved into inns and public houses, early versions of the pub. Drinking was no longer just something you did after work. It became a structured part of travel, politics, and even postal delivery. Yes, medieval mailmen drank frequently. And then came the Reformation, which poured cold water and guilt on a lot of the party. Reformers like Calvin and Knox were not big fans of public drunkenness. Suddenly, drinking became a moral battleground, and taverns were accused of being dens of sin, sloth, and questionable fiddle playing. Governments got stricter. Licensing laws multiplied, taxes increased. Public drunkenness was increasingly criminalized, but the desire for a good drink, that never went away. It just adapted. All the wives were pushed out by guilds and male-run breweries. Wine was regulated by state-appointed officials. Spirits became fashionable in court, and slowly but surely, drinking moved from an everyday necessity to more of a social choice. The Middle Ages gave way to modernity, and while we gained better sanitation, cleaner water, and slightly less mead, we also started to forget how deeply entwined alcohol had been with survival, celebration, and social life for centuries. In ancient Babylon, love was not a spontaneous, rosy-cheeked affair. It was a war. And like any good war, it required strategy, incantations, and sometimes the assistance of a very grumpy demon. Babylonian love magic didn't shy away from meddling with the supernatural. If you couldn't win someone's affection through charm, you'd write their name on a cursed clay figurine and bury it near their door. Just like that, you had leverage. Who needs roses when you've got necromancy? The Babylonians believed love could be summoned or subdued through ritual and invocation. Tablets from Mesopotamian archives describe enchantments where a priest or sorceress would call upon Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, to bend the will of a target. And Ishtar was not the gentle harp-playing type. She once destroyed an entire mountain range because someone dumped her. So yes, she knew a thing or two about vengeance and passion. Some spells included hair, nail clippings, or drops of blood, organic tokens to tether the lover's soul to the spellcaster. These were either burned in small fires, dissolved into oils, or wrapped inside fabric pouches. These pouches would be buried beneath thresholds or hidden in beds to heat the heart of the desired person. That heating could sometimes cause obsession or madness. But hey, what's love without a little side effect? And it wasn't all about attraction. Babylonian texts also mention apotropaic spells, designed to drive away unwanted suitors or remove a rival's erotic pull. In one particularly nasty charm, a woman asked the gods to make her rival's breath smell like a corpse. Subtle, effective, and guaranteed to ruin any moonlit moment. This mix of erotic desire and divine manipulation created a culture where love was a battlefield layered in ash, honey, blood, and whispers. You didn't just hope someone loved you, you dragged them into a cosmic tug-of-war, using scrolls, dolls, and invisible spirits to tip the scale. Love in Babylon was rarely mutual. It was an act of will, and when words failed, spells stepped in, etched in cuneiform, whispered to the stars, and sealed with sacred smoke. Babylonian love wasn't pure, but it was potent. In ancient Greece, love spells were less about hearts and flowers, and more about domination and desperation. The Greeks had a specific name for this magical obsession, eros. But it wasn't the gentle affection you'd write poetry about. It was a frenzied, all-consuming madness, more likely to land someone in a temple begging for mercy than walking hand in hand through olive groves. Greek love magic was split into two powerful branches, agoge spells and philia spells. Agoge spells were meant to drag someone, sometimes literally to the practitioner, usually used by men. These spells aimed to inflame lust, cause sleeplessness, and even make the victim hallucinate until they surrendered to desire. A typical Agog spell might say something like burn her heart until she comes crawling to me. Yes, crawling. Greeks were not subtle about their intentions. The spells were often written on lead tablets, cheap, durable, and heavy with symbolism, and buried in graveyards or wells, places considered gateways to the underworld. Why? Because these spells often invoked underworld spirits or restless ghosts to do the dirty work. You wanted someone to fall in love. You'd call on a dead guy who had nothing better to do. On the other hand, filial spells were more affection management. These were often used by women trying to maintain peace in marriages or control their husband's wandering eyes. Rather than summon burning passion, filial spells focused on harmony and loyalty. They were sometimes infused into wine or oil, acting like magical tranquilizers hidden in daily rituals. Of course, herbs and potions played their part. Greeks used aphrodisiacs like mandrake root, which looked vaguely human and was believed to scream when uprooted. Probably not ideal first date material. Love potions also included honey, myrrh, and even crushed bones mixed into drinks or rubbed onto clothes. A particularly strong recipe involved menstrual blood, an intimate and powerful ingredient believed to tie a man's soul to his lover's forever. Greek erotic magic wasn't romantic in a modern sense. It was strategic, visceral, and usually aimed at control rather than consent. Eros, the god of love, was often depicted blindfolded and armed with arrows for a reason. Love wasn't just blind, it was dangerous, and the Greeks knew exactly how to weaponize it. When it came to love, the ancient Romans took what the Greeks started and added more wine, more drama, and far more legal loopholes. Roman love spells weren't merely folk traditions whispered by lonely hearts. They were considered tools of influence, status preservation, and occasionally, straight-up revenge. In a society obsessed with order and honor, controlling another person's desires became a stealthy way of rewriting fate itself. Roman love magic came in many forms, but deficient binding spells were among the most popular. These were usually etched into thin sheets of lead and folded like cursed love letters before being buried in tombs or tossed into rivers. The idea? Entrap the target's mind, body, and spirit by invoking chthonic deities like Pluto or Hecate. The writing was often sharp, commanding, and full of desperate pleas. Some read like court summons, others resembled melodramatic fan fiction. A particularly eerie example from Rome asks that a woman named Victrix burn with love for me, Marcus, like a torch day and night, until she can no longer bear to be without me. Sounds romantic until you realize Marcus buried that spell next to a child's grave to add extra power. Roman ethics optional. Perfumes and oils were another ave. For magical manipulation, women would anoint themselves or their intended lovers with concoctions laced with herbs like vervain, mint, or even belladonna, which could sedate or stimulate depending on a dosage. A sweet-smelling woman might not just be trying to impress. She could have been dosing her toga-wearing crush with a micro-love spell in liquid form. One particularly scandalous Roman tactic was the so-called Venus wine, a potent love potion allegedly containing animal parts, exotic herbs, and bodily fluids. Slaves and courtesans were rumored to slip it into their masters' goblets to tilt the power balance. If the potion didn't work, at least the hangover might spark some vulnerability. Roman law, interestingly, did acknowledge love magic, but not as a crime of passion. Instead, it was lumped into sorcery and considered a public threat if it disrupted property rights or inheritance. Love was all fun and games until someone cursed a senator into celibacy. For the Romans, love was political, magical, and occasionally toxic, just the way they liked it. In ancient Egypt, love was sacred, mystical, and dangerous in the hands of the wrong priest. Egyptian love spells combined religious devotion, poetic metaphor, and, when needed, ruthless manipulation. These weren't the ramblings of a heartbroken teen. They were carefully composed rites, often recorded on papyrus and backed by the authority of deities like Hathor, Isis, and Bes. If your heart was broken in Egypt, you didn't cry. You conjured. Egyptians believed love could be stirred like a potion or unlocked like a tomb, and their magic reflected this. A common technique was the dream spell, in which the spellcaster summoned a god or demon to appear in the dream of the desired person. The spell would whisper, "You long for her like the desert longs for rain." Elegant, yes. Manipulative, absolutely. One recovered papyrus from the Ptolemaic period describes a spell where the target's heart is likened to a captive bird, fluttering endlessly unless reunited with the one who cast the charm. These texts were often written in red ink, considered magically potent, and sometimes included miniature drawings of bound figures or symbolic birds with clipped wings, a visual cue just in case the gods needed reminding. But it wasn't all about metaphor. Physical objects had power too. Wax figurines were used to represent both the spellcaster and the target. These dolls were anointed with perfumes, pierced with needles, or placed in jars with inscribed love formulas. And depending on the goal, passion or punishment, the results varied wildly. Want affection? Rub the doll with lotus oil. Want revenge for rejection? Add scorpion venom. Potions were popular, often involving ingredients like honey, wine, mandrake root, and, unsurprisingly, blood. Some spells even required menstrual blood mixed with beer, which was believed to bind the man's soul to the woman through shared essence. Offer that at a modern cocktail bar and see how it goes. What truly set Egyptian love magic apart was its divine undertone. These weren't mere tricks, they were invocations. Love and lust were seen as natural extensions of divine will, but divine will could be influenced with the right hymn, the right words, and a properly charged amulet. Ingredients that walked the line between medicine, magic, and outright poison. You weren't just wooing someone with roses, you were slipping them a cocktail of hallucinogens, animal parts, and sometimes your own bodily fluids. If modern dating is complicated, at least it doesn't usually involve powdered mummy. In ancient love magic, ingredients weren't chosen for their smell or taste. They were selected for symbolic and spiritual force. The more potent or taboo the object, the more power it was believed to have. Hair, fingernails, spit, and menstrual blood were commonly used because they contained personal essence. To bind someone, you need part of them, or part yourself. But some recipes went well beyond the personal. In Babylon, spells sometimes called for scraps of lion skin, crocodile fat, or the feathers of nocturnal birds. Creatures thought to live between worlds. In Egypt, scorpion venom might be smeared onto amulets or mixed with myrrh to stir both desire and dread. In Rome, spells occasionally included the ashes of burned bones or, disturbingly, the remains of condemned criminals. If love couldn't be earned, it would be stolen from the world of the dead. One particularly twisted Greek recipe instructed the user to obtain the bones of a bat, grind them with honey and wine, and leave the mixture beneath a moonlit statue of Aphrodite. Drink it, and your target would become mad with desire. Of course, they might also become mad. Full stop. Many potions blurred the line between aphrodisiac and poison. Belladonna, mandrake, and henbane were all popular ingredients. Taken in the right amount, they induced lightheadedness and emotional openness. Taken in the wrong amount, well, let's just say love became eternal. In a tombstone kind of way. And while men often wielded love spells to incite lust, women frequently used more subtle means, clothing enchantments, food magic, or charm bags sewn with silken herbs. These might be hidden in pillows or hung beneath beds. One Babylonian spell even instructs a woman to anoint her breasts with a sacred oil before embracing her lover, making the moment both erotic and enchanted. Not all ancient love spells were meant to ignite passion. Some were curses in disguise, wrapped in seductive words but loaded with venom. These weren't about mutual desire. They were about domination, humiliation, or vengeance. And their true goal wasn't love, it was control. In ancient Greece and Rome, many so-called love spells were actually depictions, binding curses meant to overwhelm the will of the victim. They might be phrased sweetly. May she think of no other man but me. But their methods were sinister. The idea was to shatter a person's emotional independence, rendering them sleepless, obsessed, and emotionally enslaved. If that sounds like psychological warfare, it was. These spells often targeted the mind and body. A popular Greek curse would ask deities of the underworld to bind the target's arms, legs, tongue, and even genitals, rendering them helpless unless they came crawling back to the spellcaster. Lead tablets inscribed with these curses were folded tightly, symbolizing the sealed fate of the victim, and deposited in graves, wells, or crossroads, all liminal places where divine and human realms met. One infamous Roman example begged Pluto to turn her thoughts into madness until she seeks me out in the streets. It included specific bodily instructions. Bind her knees so she cannot dance with another. Bind her lips so she cannot kiss another. It wasn't romance. It was emotional kidnapping, complete with ghostly accomplices. Sometimes these love curses included a second victim, a rival. In that case, the spell would redirect all of the target's passion to the caster, while simultaneously ruining the rival's chances. One spell from Carthage curses a woman's competitor with hair loss, a rotting voice and womb sickness, a terrifying way to ensure she wouldn't be anyone's object of affection. Even in Egypt, where love magic often took poetic forms, curses seeped in. Some spells invoked lion-headed deities to tear apart a target's peace of mind until they submitted. Others used figurines of the victim, stabbed, burned, or broken, while reciting verses to bind their heart to the practitioner. Despite the elaborate rituals and eerie curses, ancient love magic wasn't always hidden in temples or carved into cryptic tablets. Much of it lived in the ordinary, woven into the routines of daily life. For many, casting a love spell was as natural as brushing one's hair or pouring wine. Magic wasn't separate from reality, it was embedded in it. In bustling markets from Babylon to Athens, vendors didn't just sell figs and perfumes. They also sold magical charms. Small amulets made from carnelian, hematite, or bronze were carried in tunics or sewn into garments to attract affection or shield against unwanted advances. Some were shaped like phalluses, others like tiny hands or eyes, symbols believed to either charm or ward off lust. A girl might wear one when hoping to catch the attention of a suitor. A wife might tuck one under her mattress to keep her husband loyal. Love magic also slipped into food. Meals were prepared with more than just spice. There was intent. In Rome, women were known to stir aphrodisiacs into sauces, or honeyed wine laced with herbs, or serve bread kneaded with whispered spells. One Egyptian charm directed the user to breathe into the cooking pot and speak the beloved's name 3 times. Dinner became a slow seduction, each bite a step closer to enchantment. Even cosmetics weren't immune. Ancient Greek women ground special herbs into their eye mole or lip pigments, believing it would make their gaze irresistible. A spell from the Hellenistic period instructed a woman to recite lines from a hymn to Aphrodite while applying rouge, transforming her daily beautifying routine into a sacred act of attraction. Clothing, too, carried magic. A Babylonian text recommends washing a garment in enchanted water before offering it to a potential lover. In doing so, the shirt itself became a charm. And if that lover wore it, the spell was said to tighten like a net. These everyday spells weren't always grand or theatrical. They were subtle, intimate, performed in kitchens, bedrooms, and bathhouses to the ancients. Love magic wasn't reserved for desperate sorcerers or vengeful aristocrats. It was for everyone. For all their seductive promises, ancient love spells were never guaranteed to work. And when they did, the consequences could be disturbing, even tragic. While many spellcasters imagined a blissful union as the result of their magical efforts, ancient texts and warnings suggest that love magic often unraveled in unexpected and terrifying ways. The same spell meant to bind a lover could just as easily summon illness, madness, or divine punishment. In Greece and Rome, philosophers and priests alike cautioned against meddling with the will of others. Theophrastus mocked those who relied on love potions, portraying them as foolish and desperate. Pliny the Elder flat out labeled love magic as dangerous superstition, warning that its practitioners were either deluded or criminal. Even in magical papyri, cautionary lines were often included. Do not call upon this spirit unless you are ready to accept what follows, and what follows could be grotesque. One Roman legend tells of a man driven mad by a failed spell. He wandered the streets at night, calling out the name of a woman he no longer recognized. In another tale, a woman who used a potion to secure her husband's fidelity found herself the target of his obsession. As he became violent and paranoid, convinced she was unfaithful despite her original intentions, some spells even warned that the gods might turn on a user. In Egypt, invoking Hathor or Isis without proper offerings could anger the deity, bringing misfortune instead of romance. One recovered scroll states, "If she is not meant to love you, your heart shall know sorrow tenfold." That's ancient for. Don't try to force it. Rivals could also fight back. A targeted woman might hire a counter-magician to unbind her from the original spell, or to curse the practitioner in return. These magical feuds could escalate into full-blown hex wars, with spells flying in both directions, sometimes over years. Protective charms, salt circles, and sacred words were all part of the defense, perhaps most chillingly. Love spells often succeeded in creating obsession rather than affection. The victim might feel compelled but confused, physically drawn but emotionally vacant. Love turned into compulsion, a haunting echo of true connection. Though the gods of Babylon have long fallen silent, and Roman grave tablets have crumbled, the heartbeat of ancient love magic never truly stopped. It simply adapted. The spells, potions, and rituals of the ancient world evolved, repackaged into folk traditions, whispered superstitions, and even self-help rituals we still see today. Take the concept of the love potion. While modern science scoffs at the idea of aphrodisiac elixirs, the shelves of health stores still overflow with tonics promising enhanced attraction, deeper intimacy, or natural magnetism. Ancient herbs like mandrake, damiana, and ginseng still find their way into teas and oils meant to rekindle passion. We may not invoke Venus or Ishtar anymore, but the desire to bottle love remains strong. In parts of southern Italy, folk traditions continue to echo Roman and Greek magical beliefs. Red ribbons tied under mattresses, herbal sachets hidden in clothing, and whispered charms passed down through grandmothers mirror the rituals once practiced in classical temples. In St. Corners alike in parts of the Middle East and North Africa, fragments of Egyptian and Mesopotamian love magic survive in talismans worn discreetly or spells spoken during cooking. Even in pop culture, ancient love magic lives on. Films, books, and songs often portray the enchanted lover, whether it's a vampire compelled by a blood bond or a potion slipping into a wine glass at just the right moment. The trope of the love spell gone wrong remains a favorite storyline, reflecting ancient warnings that passion conjured by force may unravel into chaos. More curiously, modern psychology has uncovered parallels between old spells and techniques used to increase attraction, mirroring body language, using scent to trigger emotional memory, or timing confessions to maximize emotional impact. Were those ancient spellcasters simply using proto-psychological hacks cloaked in divine language and ritual drama? Today, love spells are still sold online, though now dressed in pastel branding and witchy aesthetics. Etsy shops offer customized candle spells, while TikTok hosts manifestation tutorials that wouldn't seem out of place on a Greek papyrus scroll. In the end, ancient love magic wasn't just about getting someone to love you. It was about regaining control in the face of longing. That impulse, timeless, desperate, beautifully human, remains with us. We still chase that same alchemy to be seen, desired, chosen. And if a little magic helps along the way, so be it. In ancient Greece, sport was not a pastime. It was a sacred duty, a divine performance of flesh and will before the gods. Nowhere was this more evident than at the Olympic Games, first held in 776 BCE in Olympia, a sanctuary site dedicated to Zeus. For over 1,000 years, Greeks from city-states across the Hellenic world gathered every 4 years, not for politics or war, but but it chased immortality through muscle and grit. The games weren't casual contests. Athletes trained for months, sometimes years, under the watchful eyes of coaches, priests, and even philosophers. Before competing, they swore an oath to Zeus, promising they had prepared honestly and would not cheat. This wasn't just formality. Breaking the oath could result in public flogging or disgraceful disqualification. Honor was everything. And if you're imagining chariot races and discus throws with dignified robes flapping in the wind, stop. Greek athletes competed completely nude. It was a celebration of the male form, yes, but also a sign of transparency. Nothing hidden, no armor, no trickery, just raw athleticism and the judgment of the gods above. The original events were simple. Foot races, long jump, discus, javelin, wrestling, and boxing. Then came the pancration, a brutal combination of wrestling and boxing with barely any rules. Fingers were broken, eyes were gouged. The crowd cheered. Death wasn't common, but it wasn't forbidden either. Winning brought more than bragging rights. Victors were crowned with a simple olive wreath, but they returned home as heroes. Some cities awarded winners with free meals for life, prime seats at the theater, or even exemption from taxes. Poets would immortalize their names. Sculptors might carve their likeness into marble. For a fleeting moment, they were godlike, but there was no room for women. Not in the audience, and certainly not as competitors. The Olympic Games were for men only, though women did have their own separate festival, the Huria, also held at Olympia, featuring foot races for unmarried girls. Still, it paled in comparison to the testosterone-fueled spectacle that defined the male arena. The Greek Olympics were more than games. They were a sacred fire, burning with ambition, discipline, and divine expectation. To run, to wrestle, to win. It wasn't just athleticism. It was a ritual. It was a legacy. It was a war without weapons. If the Greeks turned sports into sacred ritual, the Romans turned them into a blood-soaked spectacle. In the Roman Empire, athletics meant violence, and no event embodied this more than the gladiatorial games. These weren't polite matches in tunics. They were brutal performances of life and death, designed to thrill the masses, honor the dead, and remind everyone who held the power. Gladiators were typically slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. But despite their low status, they became household names. Some, like Spartacus, rose to legendary fame, admired even as they were paraded into combat for the crowd's delight. Trained in special schools called ludi, these men, and occasionally women, we were taught to fight with discipline, precision, and flair. The more theatrical, the better. Bleeding was part of the entertainment. The most famous arena was, of course, the Colosseum in Rome, an engineering marvel that could hold up to 50,000 spectators. Events were free, paid for by emperors and politicians eager to win public favor. Bread and circuses, they called it. Keep the people fed and entertained. And they won't ask too many questions about corruption or conquest. Combat styles varied. Some gladiators fought with swords and shields, secutores, others with nets and tridents, bracciarii. Each type had its own strengths, weaknesses, and costume, carefully curated to keep matchups unpredictable and exciting. The games also included mock sea battles, wild animal hunts, and public executions. It was athleticism. Meets theater, meets horror. But not every fight ended in death. Contrary to popular belief, most matches ended when one fighter conceded. Killing a well-trained gladiator was bad for business. These fighters were investments. Only the editor, the person sponsoring the games, could decide if a loser lived or died. And yes, the infamous thumbs up or down gesture. Probably a myth. Ancient sources are ambiguous. So let's chalk that up to Hollywood flair. Despite their blood-stained purpose, some gladiators achieved celebrity status. They received gifts, fan letters. Yes, ancient graffiti has been found praising their beautiful thighs and sometimes even freedom. Retired gladiators could become trainers, bodyguards, or minor celebrities. Long before football, baseball, or basketball, the peoples of Mesoamerica played a game that was part sport, part religious drama, and part cosmic allegory. Known today as the Mesoamerican ball game, or by its Nahuatl name, Alamalistli, this was no weekend leisure activity. It was a sacred rite, a political tool, and occasionally a death sentence. Played by the Olmecs, Maya, and Aztecs, the game involved a heavy rubber ball, sometimes weighing as much as 4 kilograms, that players had to keep in motion using only their hips, elbows, knees, or thighs. No hands allowed. The goal varied by region and era, but in many cases it involved hitting the ball through a vertical stone ring mounted high on the court wall. Considering the size of the ball and the limited body parts allowed, scoring a point was nothing short of miraculous. The courts, known as tlactli or pactapocarinas, were shaped like a capital I with sloping sides and often surrounded by carvings depicting gods, warriors, and scenes of sacrifice. These weren't your average playgrounds. They were stages where the divine and human collided. And it wasn't just about winning or losing. The ball game was deeply symbolic. It represented the eternal battle between life and death, day and night, the gods and the underworld. In some versions of the myth, the game was reenacting the journey of the hero twins from the Maya Populver, who descended into the underworld, and played against death itself. The most controversial element? Ritual sacrifice. Contrary to popular myth, not all games ended in death, but many important matches, especially those tied to religious festivals, did. The sacrifices weren't always the losers either. In some elite contexts, the captain of the winning team was offered as a noble tribute to the gods, ascending in theory to divine favor through death. Others argue it was the losers who paid the price, a public display of cosmic justice. What's undeniable is the cultural weight of the game. It wasn't mere entertainment. It was theology in motion. The thud of the rubber ball echoed through temple plazas, a heartbeat of belief, identity, and power. When it came to physical activity, the ancient Egyptians blended leisure, ritual, and preparation for the afterlife. Sports weren't simply a diversion. They were reflections of cosmic balance, royal power, and divine order. While they lacked massive public arenas like the Greeks or Romans, Egyptian society still nurtured athleticism with a spiritual undercurrent that made every movement meaningful. Wrestling was perhaps the most visually documented of all ancient Egyptian sports. Tomb paintings dating back over 4,000 years show pairs of young men locked in grapples, executing complex throws and holds that wouldn't look out of place in modern judo. These weren't stage performances. They were serious training exercises that emphasized discipline, coordination, and balance. Wrestling was often used to train soldiers and elite guards, but also had ritual significance. The eternal struggle between order, Mahat, and chaos. Archery was another vital sport, especially for the pharaohs. Depictions of rulers firing arrows from chariots, sometimes while the vehicle was in motion, were not just records of skill, but political propaganda. A strong pharaoh was a divinely approved one, and mastery of the bow was proof of divine favor and martial readiness during festivals. Kings would sometimes demonstrate their prowess by shooting arrows through copper rings, surrounded by cheering priests and nobles. Rowing competitions also held a place in ancient Egyptian life, especially along the Nile. Crews of young men competed in ceremonial regattas, their synchronized strokes reflecting discipline and unity. These weren't just for sport. They honored the gods and recreated mythical journeys, like the solar bark of Ra crossing the heavens. For the everyday Egyptian, sports included tug-of-war, leapfrog-like jumping games, and rhythmic dancing activities, both joyful and communal. Children practiced balancing and acrobatics, while laborers stayed physically fit through their daily work. Athletic games during festivals often served as community bonding and religious observance, blending sweat with spirituality, interestingly. Egyptian women participated more than in many ancient cultures. Wall paintings show female dancers and gymnasts performing at banquets and ceremonies, often in celebration of fertility and divine femininity. While not competitive in the modern sense, these performances were athletic, graceful, and held symbolic weight. In ancient China, sports weren't just about physical prowess. They were tightly woven into the fabric of Confucian values, military training, imperial politics, and the pursuit of harmony between mind and body. From battlefield simulations to courtly pastimes, athletic activities served both the elite and commoners, often reflecting deeper philosophical ideals. Archery held a particularly exalted place. In Confucian tradition, the nobleman was expected to master the bow not only as a warrior, but as a gentleman. Competitions were formalized and deeply ritualistic. During the Zhou dynasty, archery contests were held in ceremonial halls where etiquette mattered as much as accuracy. Participants bowed, recited prescribed phrases, and shot not to kill, but to demonstrate inner virtue and discipline. Hitting the target was seen as a metaphor for hitting moral perfection. But not all sports in ancient China were so serene. Enter Jiu, Chinese polo. Introduced during the Han Dynasty and reaching peak popularity under the Tang, polo became the sport of emperors, generals, and aristocrats. Played on horseback with long mallets, it was thrilling, fast-paced, and surprisingly dangerous. Emperor Shizong of Tang even died in a polo accident. Still, the sport was embraced by both men and women of the court. Noble women in silk robes could be seen galloping alongside their male counterparts, striking balls with astonishing agility. In an age of rigid gender roles, polo briefly leveled the playing field. Military sports also flourished. Cuju, an early form of soccer, was originally developed to keep soldiers agile and coordinated. Players kicked a leather ball through a net or hole in a wall, using precise footwork over time. Cuju became a popular civilian game as well, eventually gaining recognition as the earliest documented form of football. Martial arts, too, found expression through sport. Wushu and early forms of kung fu weren't just combat techniques, they were disciplines that cultivated the spirit as much as the body. Sparring matches and strength tests were common in military academies and public demonstrations, often staged during festivals. Even games like chess and Go Wei Qi. They were viewed as mental sports, testing strategy, foresight, and emotional control. The ideal sportsman wasn't merely strong. He was balanced, restrained, and morally upright. In the ancient Near East, spanning Mesopotamia, Assyria, Persia, and beyond, sports were rarely just games. Athleticism was often a reflection of power, divine favor, and military preparedness. Physical feats weren't celebrated in isolation. They were part of public ritual, royal image building, and the cultural machinery of the empire. In Mesopotamia, the earliest known urban civilizations developed a range of physical activities, though they didn't formalize sport quite like the Greeks. Wrestling, for example, features prominently in Sumerian art and literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the hero wrestling the wild man Enkidu in a contest so fierce that it shakes the very foundations of the city, only for the two to end up as lifelong companions. Wrestling wasn't just for sport. It symbolized raw strength, dominance, and respect among equals. Kings were expected to be physically formidable. Assyrian and Babylonian rulers often commissioned reliefs, showing themselves hunting lions or engaging in military drills. These weren't staged for mere vanity. They were political statements. Killing a lion by hand wasn't just a show of courage. It declared that the king could tame chaos and uphold order. That lion hunt, it was state-sponsored propaganda in muscular form. The Persians under the Achaemenid Empire developed one of the earliest formalized military training programs that blended athletics with ethics. Young boys were taught to ride horse, draw a bow, and speak the truth, a triad that fused sport warfare and moral education. Archery and horse riding were both vital not just for battle readiness, but as symbols of elite status. Public displays of strength also played a role in temple rituals. Festivals often included competitions like foot races, stone lifting, or even ceremonial fights, depending on the region and deity being honored. These events were watched by priests, officials, and sometimes even kings, reinforcing the idea that the body, like the city or the cosmos, needed to be strong and disciplined. One unique contribution from the Near East was the use of board games like the royal game of UR, which, while not physically demanding, were seen as mental duels, sometimes even tools for divination. Just like with archery or wrestling, success reflected divine favor in the ancient civilizations of South Asia. Particularly the Indus Valley and early Vedic societies, physical culture was deeply interwoven with social hierarchy, spiritual training, and the pursuit of balance between body and mind. Though archaeological evidence from the Indus Valley is sparse in terms of organized sport, clues from urban planning, figurines, and later Vedic texts reveal a society that valued physical agility, strength, and discipline. In the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, featured large public baths and open courtyards that may have been used for communal gatherings, water rituals, or athletic exercises. Terracotta figurines show people in dynamic poses, wrestlers, dancers, and acrobats, suggesting that movement and performance were essential parts of daily life. Though no Olympic-style events are documented, the environment hints at a culture where the body was trained not just for survival, but for aesthetic and ritual purposes. As society transitioned into the Vedic period, the emphasis on physical prowess became more codified, particularly through Dana Veda, the ancient science of warfare. Young warriors were trained in archery, swordsmanship, chariot driving, and hand-to-hand combat. Competitions often accompanied royal festivals, where princes showcased their martial skill to assert dominance and attract political alliances. Wrestling Malaysia emerged as one of the most revered sports in ancient India. More than just brute force, it was a spiritual practice. Wrestlers followed strict dietary and moral codes, lived disciplined lives, and often trained in temples. The Akhara, a traditional wrestling school, functioned like a monastery, emphasizing mental purity as much as physical strength. The practice survives today in modified forms, still deeply respected. Ball games and dice games also appear in Sanskrit texts. Kreda, the Sanskrit word for sport, encompassed everything from racing animals to playing strategy games. In the Mahabharata, even divine heroes like Krishna and Arjuna are shown participating in sports, often using their skills as metaphors for cosmic struggle. Yoga, too, originated during this period, not as a gentle stretching routine, but as a rigorous system of physical and mental discipline aimed at achieving spiritual liberation. Athleticism here was not for glory, but transcendence. Though often overlooked in historical accounts, women in the ancient world did participate in sports, though usually under strict limitations and in gender-specific arenas. When women trained, competed, or performed physical feats, it was often tied to fertility, grace, or ritual purity, rather than public spectacle or competition. Yet across cultures we find surprising evidence of female athleticism, sometimes celebrated, sometimes suppressed, but never absent. In ancient Greece, women were banned from the Olympic Games, not just from competing, but even from watching. However, they had their own festival, the Heraia, held in Olympia in honor of the goddess Hera. Young, unmarried girls raced barefoot in tunics shorter than the norm, their hair loose in contrast to married women's veils. Though there was no javelin or pancration, victory was still rewarded with olive crowns and commemorated with statues. In Sparta, women enjoyed far more athletic freedom. Spartan girls trained publicly in running, wrestling, and throwing, often competing in front of male audiences. Their athleticism was seen as a civic virtue. Strong mothers produced strong warriors. While the rest of Greece found this shocking, Sparta viewed female strength as foundational to their militarized society. In Egypt, tomb paintings and reliefs show women dancing, leaping, and performing gymnastic feats, particularly in festivals and religious ceremonies. These performances, though not competitive, were demanding and athletic. Some scenes even show paired female acrobats in mid-air poses, suggesting a long tradition of trained movement and physical artistry. Ancient Rome offers more complex examples. While elite Roman women rarely engaged in public sport, lower-class women and slaves occasionally performed in arenas as gladiatresses, female gladiators. Though rare, inscriptions confirm their existence more commonly. Women participated in ball games, swimming, and equestrian training within private villas. In China, Tang Dynasty records show noblewomen playing polo, one of the only major sports that allowed women and men to compete side by side. Dressed in flowing robes, they galloped through imperial courts, striking balls with precision. These scenes shocked later Confucian historians, but they demonstrate a brief window where elite women wielded athletic agency. Though the crowds have vanished, and the dust of ancient stadiums has long settled, the spirit of ancient sports still pulses through the modern world. From Olympic gold medals to football stadium chants, today's athletic culture owes more than just inspiration to the ancient world. It inherits its structure, its spectacle, and even its soul. The Olympic Games themselves are a direct resurrection. Revived in 1896, the modern Olympics were consciously modeled on their Greek ancestors. Complete with ceremonial oaths, laurel motifs, and even the flame, a symbol once sacred to Hestia, the values may have shifted from divine favor to international cooperation, but the essential goal remains to celebrate the physical limits of the human body. Roman influence echoes in our love for stadium sports, massive arenas, structured leagues, and the theatricality of modern games from entrance music to over-the-top commentary. Mirror the gladiatorial shows of the Colosseum. Even the idea of cheering sections, uniforms, and sports as national identity can be traced back to the imperial pageantry of Rome. Mesoamerican traditions resonate in the ways we tie sports to ritual and symbolism. Though no modern game ends in human sacrifice, thankfully we still speak of athletes as warriors, matches as battles, and trophies as sacred objects. Victory remains mythologized. From China's elegant archery contest to the militaristic discipline of Persian training, the idea of sport as moral education has endured. Modern martial arts continue to teach not just movement, but respect, restraint, and self-mastery, values rooted in ancient codes. Even forgotten games like Cuju and Kreta have seen renewed interest as historians and enthusiasts seek to rediscover the diverse origins of modern athletics. Ancient board games, too, are reappearing in popular culture, not as dusty relics, but as reminders that competition isn't always physical. Perhaps most striking is how the ancient world framed sports as more than recreation. They were political tools, religious expressions, and acts of identity. Today, when athletes kneel, speak out, or represent entire nations, we're seeing the same tradition unfold. Sport as narrative, as power, as legacy. In short, the ancient world didn't just invent games. It invented the idea that through sport, humanity could aspire to greatness. Not just strength or speed, but honor, meaning, and the eternal pursuit of something just beyond our reach. Paris, the city of light, romance, revolution, and art. But few tourists realize that beneath the elegant boulevards and iconic monuments lies another city, far darker and infinitely more silent. A shadow Paris stitched together by tunnels, carved into limestone and lined wall to wall with bones. This is the Catacombs, a 200-mile underworld filled with the remains of over 6 million people. The descent into the catacombs begins innocently enough. A spiral staircase leads you down, away from the noise of the living world. The air grows colder, the light dims, and then you're there in the ossuary, a space where walls are literally made of human bones, stacked with disturbing precision. Skulls are arranged in rows like trophies, femurs cross-hatched in decorative patterns. Some tunnels even form shapes, hearts, crosses, columns. It's morbidly artistic and disturbingly calm. This macabre labyrinth was never built with tourists in mind. In fact, the catacombs began as limestone quarries dug as early as the Roman era. Paris grew by using the very bones of its earth. Limestone for buildings, cathedrals, bridges, but by the 1700s, those empty quarry tunnels would take on a new role because the living were running out of room for the dead. By the mid-18th century, Paris faced a dire crisis. Its cemeteries, particularly the infamous Saints Innocents, were so overcrowded that corpses were literally spilling into nearby buildings. The stench overpowering disease is inevitable. Something had to be done in 1786. Officials began exhuming millions of corpses from overflowing graveyards and relocating them into the abandoned quarries. Workers moved cartloads of bones under cover of night, a grim procession lit by torchlight. The bones were dumped at first, then rearranged later into the haunting formations we see today. It wasn't just sanitation, it was a spectacle. The result is a vast necropolis beneath a modern metropolis, a place where time stands still, where bones of plague victims, revolutionaries, and medieval monks rest side by side. The catacombs don't just preserve the dead, they hold the memory of a city that has always teetered between beauty and decay. So while Paris above sparkles with elegance, below it sleeps, silent, dark, and watching. By the mid-1700s, Paris was running out of space, not for the living, but for the dead. Cemeteries had become overburdened to the point of collapse. Quite literally the most infamous offender, the Cimetière des Innocents, located in the center of the city. It had been in use for nearly 1,000 years and had accumulated centuries of corpses, layer upon layer in shared graves, often stacked 6 or 7 deep. As the population grew, so did the problem by the 18th century. The Innocents and other cemeteries had become bubbling pits of decay. The smell was inescapable, seeping into homes, churches, and markets. Residents near Saint Innocents complained of unbearable stench and frequent sickness. Meat spoiled faster. The water tasted strange. In some accounts, walls of nearby basements began to crack and leak human remains. It wasn't just grotesque, it was dangerous. In 1763, King Louis XV issued a royal decree banning burials within the city, but the church resisted. Cemeteries were sacred ground. Bodies were to rest in consecrated soil. But by the 1780s, the situation had reached a tipping point. After a cellar wall collapsed due to the weight of decomposing bodies on the other side, public health officials demanded a solution. The dead could no longer stay above ground. Enter the abandoned limestone quarries. These underground chambers, remnants of Paris's building boom, were mostly unused, dark, cold, and far from the eyes of the city, perfect for a mass relocation of human remains. In 1786, authorities began transferring bones from Saint Innocents to the subterranean network. The work was conducted at night out of public view. Workers wore long robes, and the carts of bones were draped in black cloth. Priests accompanied the processions, chanting the rites of the dead. It was equal parts grim and reverent. The transfer of bodies continued for decades. Other cemeteries were emptied too, Saint Etienne de Grès, Madeleine, and Montmartre among them. As more bones filled the tunnels, officials began arranging them into patterns, both to save space and to provide a somber sense of order. This crisis, born of too many dead and too little land, created one of the world's most chilling monuments. The catacombs weren't just a solution, they were a reminder that even in death, the city must be managed. Step into the ossuaries section of the catacombs of Paris, and it becomes instantly clear this is no random bone dump. This is architecture, a cold, meticulous symmetry crafted not from stone or brick, but from human remains. Skulls line the walls in neat rows, framed by femurs and tibias. Some sections form patterns, hearts, crosses, arches. Every structure is built not just to store bones, but to transform them into a kind of subterranean art. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It was the work of Louis Etienne Ericard de Thury, the inspector of quarries during the early 19th century. While earlier transfers had simply involved piling bones in heaps, Ericard had a different vision. He believed the catacombs could serve as a moral and aesthetic monument, both a solution to overcrowded cemeteries and a reflection on the transience of life. Under his direction, the ossuary was cleaned, organized, and arranged into the haunting gallery we see today. The bones themselves, taken from millions of bodies, were anonymous. There are no names, no tombstone, just bone upon bone, arranged like library shelves of the dead. The only identifiers are plaques, small stone markers denoting which cemetery the remains came from and the year they were transferred. In some sections, poetic inscriptions appear. One reads, "Stop. This is the empire of death." Structural stability was concerned too. The bones weren't just decoration, they were used to reinforce the existing tunnels in some places. Bones are packed behind retaining walls, hidden from view, but essential for holding up the narrow corridors. Engineers had to be careful. They were working beneath the very city of Paris, and a collapse would mean more than just ruined tunnels. It could take whole neighborhoods with it. Lighting was sparse in the early days, just flickering oil lamps or torches that made the shadows dance across eye sockets and rib cages today. Electric lights make the scenes less ominous, but no less surreal. This wasn't simply an ossuary. It was an engineered underworld, a blend of functionality, respect, and macabre display. A space designed to humble the living and give a silent voice to the countless dead. Here, every wall is a reminder. Architecture can be beautiful and terrifying. Walk a few steps deeper into the catacombs of Paris, and the faces blur because there are none. 6 million bodies reduced to identical bones. No names, no epitaphs. Just rows upon rows of anonymous skulls, silently watching. But behind this eerie uniformity lies a haunting question. Who are they? The answer is everyone. The catacombs hold the remains of ordinary Parisians who lived and died over centuries. Bakers, servants, priests, midwives, soldiers, children, people who once crowded the city's cramped neighborhoods, who walked its muddy streets and worshipped in its cathedrals. When their graves overflowed and cemeteries began to rot, they were moved here, becoming part of this great subterranean ossuary. Some of the bones belonged to victims of plagues, especially the Black Death and later cholera outbreaks. Disease killed in such numbers that cemeteries became mass graves. Others died in famines, fires, or childbirth. Some had been buried for centuries and were mostly skeletal when exhumed. Others had barely decomposed. The process of relocating them was unpleasant, grim, and unsentimental. A solution, not a ceremony. But not all the dead were commoners. The bones of French nobles, clergy, and revolutionaries also found their way here, especially as political upheaval swept the city. During the French Revolution, when guillotines turned public squares into rivers of blood, victims were often dumped in mass graves and later moved underground. Some claim the remains of key revolutionaries like Danton, Robespierre, or Camille Desmoulins were relocated to the catacombs, but no official records confirm their exact placement. Down here, titles and ranks disappear. There's also the curious case of the Val de Grace quarry section, believed to hold the bones of monks and nuns. These religious communities, once buried in convent gardens, were eventually displaced like everyone else when Paris needed more room for the dead. And then there are the children, smaller bones scattered among the stacks. No markers, no dates, just silent testimony to lives cut short. By design, the catacombs erase identity. In death, all are equal. Peasant, poet, plague victim, or patriot. The anonymity is overwhelming. 6 million souls reduced to geometry. And yet in their silence they speak of the sheer weight of history, of the cost of city life, and of a society that once stood shoulder to shoulder and now lies skull to skull. While tourists shuffle through the official section of the catacombs, roughly a mile of sanitized, well-lit corridors, beneath their feet lies a forbidden world. A shadow network of uncharted tunnels, locked doors, and centuries-old pathways, crawling with graffiti, hidden chambers, and the occasional underground rave. Welcome to the domain of the cataphiles. Cataphiles are urban explorers who defy city law to access the forbidden zones of the Paris catacombs. They use hidden entrances, manholes in parks, storm drains, or basement trapdoors. Once inside, they navigate by memory, hand-drawn maps, or intuition. There are no signs, no safety rails, and no cell service, only the sound of your own footsteps echoing through the dark. This isn't just thrill-seeking. For many cataphiles, the catacombs are a second city, a sacred space of history, rebellion, and creativity. Over decades, they've carved out rooms in the tunnels, makeshift libraries, art galleries, and even cinemas. Some host clandestine parties deep underground, generators, speakers, and candlelight illuminating a dance floor built over stacked bones. The cataphile community is tight-knit and fiercely protective. Entry is often by invitation only. Newcomers, called tourists, are often tested for respect and survival skills. The golden rule: never disturb the bones, never tag sacred sites, and never get caught, because this is all illegal. In 1955, French authorities declared all unofficial exploration of the catacombs prohibited. The risks were and are real. The tunnels are unstable in places, prone to collapse. Some are flooded, others are filled with tight crawl spaces and dead ends that could disorient even seasoned explorers. Over the years, there have been injuries, arrests, and even deaths. In one notorious case, a man went missing for days and was found delirious in a remote section, guided out only by search dogs. Despite the dangers, the city's catacomb police, the cataflex, struggle to stop the trespassing. The system is simply too vast. Every time a known entrance is sealed, a new one is found. The cataphiles return. They always return. For them, the catacombs are more than bones. They are freedom, mystery, a place where Paris breathes differently, where time dissolves, and where the living walk alongside the dead, not in fear, but in reverence. Wander deep enough into the Paris catacombs, and the silence gives way. Not to voices, but to symbols. Messages scratched into limestone, cryptic arrows, names, faces, cryptic poetry, and fading paint. This is the language of the tunnels, a tapestry of graffiti, signs, and secret codes left by generations of cataphiles, workers, soldiers, and the dead. Some of the oldest markings come from quarrymen, centuries before the catacombs became a burial site. These early miners carved dates, initials, and directional arrows into the walls to track where they'd been. Many engraved their names with pride, like time-stamped signatures in the earth. Others marked exits, stone quality, or left sketches, simple images of pickaxes, candles, even ships. These weren't just idle doodles, they were survival tools in a lightless maze. Once the catacombs became an ossuary, a new language emerged. Carved plaques from the 18th and 19th centuries that label which cemetery the bones came from. Some include haunting epigrams. Where is death always behind you? Others quote scripture or Latin maxims about the vanity of life and the certainty of death. But deeper in the forbidden zones, modern hands have added their own voice. Cataphile graffiti flourished in the 20th century. Some pieces are artistic masterpieces, elaborate murals painted by flashlight, entire walls transformed into glowing skeletons, mythical beasts, or surreal portraits. Other markings are practical, arrows pointing toward known exits, nicknames etched into stone, or coded directions like GV Chalice 30 minutes to Montague. The tunnels have their own unofficial map, an oral cartography passed among cataphiles. Locations bear cryptic names. The beach, a sand-filled cavern. The cellar, the cathedral, the sandbox. Some walls are nicknamed for the images on them. The mushroom forest, the elephant room. Without this insider knowledge, getting lost isn't just possible. It's almost guaranteed. There are also marks of occupation, candle holders carved into walls, benches made of scavenged stone, rusted hinges where makeshift doors once stood. Some explorers bring stencils or ink stamps marking their visits like underground passports. Others leave behind poems, bottle caps, or small figurines, quiet offerings to a world of eternal night. In the catacombs, language becomes legacy. Every scrawl, every arrow, every whisper and paint is part of an evolving chronicle, telling us someone was here, someone passed through, and someone wanted to be remembered. During times of war, the Paris catacombs were more than a macabre curiosity. They became a battlefield in the shadows. Beneath the streets, while bombs fell and regimes shifted above, the catacombs served as shelter, hideout, and strategic weapon. For centuries, they've been a part of Paris's wartime story, quiet, secretive, and essential. During the French Revolution, bones were still being transferred underground, but the tunnels were already becoming more than storage. As the guillotine claimed heads by day, the catacombs absorbed the mounting remains by night. Rumors swirled that revolutionaries used the tunnels to move undetected across the city, plotting in the dark. These passages weren't just for the dead, they were tactical. In World War II, the catacombs entered a new chapter of intrigue. When Nazi Germany occupied Paris in 1940, the Wehrmacht and the SS mapped sections of the catacombs for military use. In one infamous case, a bunker was constructed beneath the Lys Montaigne, right within the tunnel system. Hidden from the Allies, it served as a command post, complete with reinforced walls, supply storage, and communication lines. But the resistance was watching the French resistance, ever resourceful. Also used the catacombs underneath enemy-controlled Paris. They navigated these tunnels with expert knowledge, staging ambushes, smuggling weapons, and conducting meetings in the echoing dark. It was a game of subterranean cat and mouse. One level below the Nazis, French fighters moved like ghosts. The cataphiles of the time, those already familiar with the unofficial sections, became invaluable. Their knowledge of hidden entrances and obscure routes turned the catacombs into a guerrilla labyrinth. Some sections still show evidence of their presence. Resistance, graffiti, remains of ration cans, and even defensive structures built into the stone. Bomb shelters were carved during air raids. Ordinary citizens sometimes fled to the tunnels during Allied bombings or Nazi crackdowns. Down there, in the stillness, families waited, bones on one side, war above hope. Somewhere in between. After the war, many of these wartime sections were sealed off or forgotten, but traces remain. A rusted door, a pile of gas mask filters, a scorched wall. The catacombs held secrets long before the 20th century, but in wartime they became something more. A crucible of survival and the quiet defiance of a city that refused to die. Where there are bones and darkness, legends follow. The Paris catacombs are no exception. Over the centuries, these tunnels have become the breeding ground for myths, ghost stories, and urban legends that blur the line between reality and nightmare. Once a burial solution, the catacombs now host a folklore of their own, one that continues to grow with every new echo in the dark. One of the most famous tales is that of the Phantom of the Catacombs. Some say it's a long-dead quarryman who got lost and now wanders the tunnels, his footsteps heard but never seen. Others claim he's a plague victim, cursed to roam the ossuary forever, seeking his lost family among the 6 million skulls. Whether ghost or metaphor, visitors and explorers alike have reported disembodied whispers, cold gusts of air, and sudden nausea in certain sections of the tunnels, especially near older, untouched ossuaries. Then there's the legend of the camcorder tape. In the early 1990s, a group of cataphiles allegedly found a video camera deep in a restricted section. The footage, later broadcast on French television, showed a man wandering alone through the tunnels, increasingly panicked, running, spinning, lost. Eventually, he drops the camera. No one knows who he was or what happened to him. The clip ends in silence, and he was never identified. The story became a modern myth, the lost explorer who never found the surface again. Other stories are more surreal. There are whispered accounts of rooms filled with human bones arranged into chairs and thrones, or of underground cults using the catacombs for rituals. One sealed chamber, discovered in the early 2000s. It had a working phone line, a fully stocked bar, and an underground cinema on the wall. A chilling message: do not try to find us. Despite skepticism, the power of the catacombs mythos is undeniable. It feeds on the natural fear of the dark, the unknown, and the sheer weight of death. The space is real, but the stories live in the gaps between candlelight and shadow, between echoes and silence. Whether you believe the tales or not, one thing is certain. Deep beneath Paris, fear breathes easily, and the catacombs never sleep. Today, the catacombs of Paris are one of the city's strangest and most visited attractions. Each year, hundreds of thousands descend into this empire of death, not for funerals or rituals, but for curiosity, for selfies with skulls, for the thrill of standing among 6 million of the once living. It's a place where mortality is laid bare, yet marketed with a ticket stub and a brochure. The official ossuary, opened to the public in 1809, was originally intended to be a place of reflection, a memento mori for a city too focused on the surface. Early visitors were guided through by lantern light, sometimes accompanied by priests or scholars. Today, the lighting is brighter. The walls are more secure, but the feeling remains a quiet awe, a dread mixed with wonder. Tourism has only grown since the 19th century. Poets, philosophers, and artists have long been drawn to the catacombs. Victor Hugo wandered its depths for inspiration. Salvador Dali called it beautiful. And for many, it's become a pilgrimage, not just to confront death, but to marvel at how meticulously death has been organized, stacked, and displayed. Yet the catacombs remain controversial. Critics argue that turning mass graves into tourist attractions is disrespectful, reducing human lives to decor. Others point out that few visitors realize what they're seeing. These aren't props. They're people, real individuals, once with names, faces, families. Now anonymous relics of a buried past. Still, the catacombs serve a powerful purpose. They remind us of scale, the sheer number of lives lived before us. They are, quite literally, the foundation of Paris, the dead supporting the living. Bones that once carried bread, books, or revolution now hold up the city's myths and sidewalks. But strangely, the moment you climb the staircase and return to the surface, Paris feels different. Louder, brighter, more alive. Because in the end, the catacombs don't glorify death. They sharpen our sense of life, its fragility, its brevity, and its beauty. Beneath Paris lies its deepest truth. Everything we build on bones. And someday, perhaps the city will add ours to the archive.